to not only our culture today, how we navigate some of the different issues that you may experience, whether you work in your own family, these different areas. So we know that ultimately this will be something that can help us to navigate some of those, maybe Thanksgiving conversations, or even some of the things that you're navigating with your job, but also too, knowing that, Dr. Gurry and coming from Phoenix Seminary, I think what this will also offer us ultimately too is something that's deeply teleological in the sense that we are creating the image of a divine being, the infinite God of all creation. And the way in who you were created to be is no accident. There's meaning to that, and your sex that he gave you. And so understanding ultimately the heart of God, but the handprint of God on your life, I pray will grow your faith and ultimately your awe of your creator today, looking at some of this different material that we're going to go through. And so I'm excited about this. I think this will be a great day. So we're going to kind of break it down into 3 different sessions. There's 3 50-minute sessions we'll have. Each of those sessions afterwards, we'll have about a 10-minute break. We'll break for lunch about noon. We'll have some goodies here, some sandwiches and some different things. In the North Cafe, we can have lunch together. Then after that, we'll have one more session, but then also a question and answer time. So, I'm putting Dr. Gurry on the spot. I know he gets so many different questions, but come with the most practical questions you can get, the questions you're dealing with, the questions you're wondering through, and we'll hopefully talk through some of those and give you, some different ways to equip you to kind of navigate some of those things you have questions about. And so, I introduced Dr. Gurry in a moment. I just want to pray for us and kind of our morning this morning. And so would you join me in prayer? So, Father, I thank you. I thank you for everyone that's here, Lord. Everyone that came out today. And I know, again, there's so many different things we could be doing with our Saturdays, but we want to give this to you ultimately, God. This is a worthy pursuit. We come with questions. We come with interest in how do we navigate these times, God, especially when it comes to gender, sex, and you. What does that look like, Lord? Some of the different themes we're talking about today. You created us with divine purpose. We are no accident. We have meaning, and ultimately, your imprint is on our life. And so, God, help us to understand today. God, I pray that you would speak through Dr. Gurry. I pray that, God, you would carry him along, that ultimately the message that he has today, the different facts, the different understandings, the different things that he studied so hard to present, it will be something that will bless our lives, God. And so give us ears to hear. Keep us focused today, even with the notes, the outlines. I thank you for all these different tools we have. Help our understanding to grow, God, but also help our awe of you grow. May we worship you, God, and understand that who we are ultimately in your eyes, but give us grace and truth to handle those who maybe have a different understanding of some of the things we're talking about today. Help us to navigate these things with kindness and gentleness, but also, ultimate truth in who you are and what your word says, Lord. So I thank you for today. Thank you for Dr. Gurry coming down from Phoenix, God, investing in our church. We love you and we thank you, Lord. Bless today. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen. All right, so I want to invite Dr. Gurry up, and Dr. Gurry might give a little bit about himself, but he's one of my old professors at Phoenix Seminary. He's been up there for a handful of years now, and kind of specializing in New Testament, I believe, but he's also he's a co-founder of what they call a Text and Canon Institute. We actually had his kind of cohort, Dr. Mead, about a year and a half ago. He was down here talking about the reliability of the scriptures, why we can trust the Bible, how we got the Bible, and so they kind of do that together. And actually, this is kind of a presentation that Dr. Gurry sent me a while ago. He kind of did his own church. He's an elder at his own church at Whitten Avenue Bible Church in Phoenix. And it challenged me. It was a great discussion over a number of sessions, so he kind of had to condense it to kind of some of the main points here. But it was very challenging for me. And again, it was one of those things that kind of helped my understanding of some of the different things that we face. And I know that will do for you as well. And so, Dr. Gurry, it is all yours.
Thanks very much, Mark. It's great to be here. Thanks for coming out on a Saturday morning, especially with this beautiful weather. I assume you guys are like we are in Phoenix. This is last week was like your first week of good weather. Is that right? Yeah. So I can imagine people saw that and thought, I'm going to go hiking. So thanks for being here this morning. We're going to talk about this question of what I call sexual difference, okay, or gender. We'll talk about those terms in just a minute. But I think it's fair to say we'd all agree that we live in a time of great confusion about this topic, don't we? And the questions that we're going to answer today deal with things that are going to confront us both, if I can put it this way, in big ways and little ways. What do I mean by that? Well, it's everything from a Supreme Court justice who's being interviewed by Congress and being asked, what is a woman? And she can't give an answer, right? That's big level. Like, when I was a kid, asking a politician, what is a woman, was not considered a gotcha question, right? But it is today. It really is. But it's also small, Because a few months, well, actually, this was a couple years ago now, my daughter was sitting next to me in church during the normal Sunday sermon. Our pastor was preaching, and she leaned over to me. She was about 11 at the time, and she said, "Dad, can girls preach?" Now, we're right in the middle of the sermon, right? Dad does not have time for a 30-minute exegesis of some key passages in the right? And that's what I mean by it's big. It's at the level of a Supreme Court justice being asked this in front of the whole world to an 11-year-old sitting next to you in the pew, right? These questions about gender are everywhere in our society today. And what I want to do with us this morning is look at this. We're going to look at some biblical passages along the way, but in some ways we're not going to spend the bulk of our time looking at Scripture. And the reason for that is not because I don't think Scripture has important things to say or that we shouldn't turn there, but it's actually because I'm convinced that what often happens today is we come to the Bible with so many cultural assumptions, so many things that society has taught us, so many things that technology, as we're going to see, has taught us, that when we come to the Bible, we actually don't hear it well when it does tell us about the differences between men and women and why God designed them the way they are. So what we're going to do a lot of today is kind of what I would call maybe like clearing the ground, right? Clearing the ground so that when we come back to the Bible and hear what it teaches on these matters, we can hear it more clearly and we can hear it as good, which is, I think, what it is. All right. Now, let me say something up front here before we get in, okay? Somebody has said that no one is ever going to win the battle of the sexes because there's too much fraternizing with the enemy, right? And in some ways, that's what we're talking a lot about today. We're talking about that sort of the long-standing battle of the sexes, right? How do men and women get along? And I want to suggest to you that's a good way to think of it. We're not going to win it, and we shouldn't actually think of it as a battle. When we think about the differences between men and women, I want you by the end of the day to think of them not as something we should fight over, but something we should celebrate and honor, right? And the reason I think that's so important is because even though I think this, as the joke is the truth of the joke is no one is actually going to win the battle of the sexes. That's a losing proposition to constantly fight, right? Men and women were actually made for each other, not made to fight against each other, right? The problem is, while neither side is ultimately going to win that battle, I do think it's just possible that both sides could lose. Does that make sense? Both sides could lose the battle of the sexes. And so again, what I want to do with us this morning is help us to see why we shouldn't actually think of it as a battle. We should think that men and women are on the same team, but we are different in really good and important ways. All right? We're going to do it in 3 different talks, okay? There's a lot we could get into in this. When we get to the Q&A, you can ask me anything you want. I cannot promise I'll have an answer for everything you ask me, but I will throw it open wide as you want to go. But because this topic can take us so deep and get us into so many different things, I've tried to keep the outline as simple as possible, all right, for clarity's sake. Because again, I know this raises all sorts of questions as we go. So to sort of keep us from drowning in all the material, we're going to keep the outline simple. And what I want to do with you is just talk about 3 things. I want to argue this morning that the differences between men and women, male and female, are real, important, and good. All right? So that's where we're going this morning. First talk is going to be why I think the differences are real. Second one, we're going to talk about why they're important. And third, we'll talk about why they're good for us. Okay? Now, a quick note on terms. Okay? I don't want to get too bogged down, but this is sort of, let me wear my professor hat for a minute. Okay? Guys, I don't think the clicker's working now. There's no one at the AV desk. Okay, sorry. Until they get that fixed, okay? I've generally tried to avoid the term gender, okay? Although it's inevitable. You can't ultimately avoid it. But here's why I avoid the term gender. I think when we use the term gender for what we're talking about this morning, it tends to cloud the discussion rather than clarify it. Why? Because too often the word gender severs the link with biological sex, with our biology, with our bodies. Oh, there we go. Okay, thanks, guys. All right. And in fact, if you think about the term gender, it's only recently that we've used this term gender to talk about the differences between men and women, okay? If you were to go back 100 years, say, nobody in English was using the term gender to talk about male and female. The term gender was a grammatical term. It's a term I use when I teach my students Greek, right? Or if you know Spanish or Italian or French, right? You know that some nouns are masculine, Some nouns are feminine and some nouns are neuter, right? That's all people meant by this term gender. And here's the significant thing, though. In the 20th century, another shift started to happen that affected this word gender, and that is people started to use the term sex to refer to the activity of intercourse, right? Whereas before they'd use all sorts of euphemisms, some of which we still use today, okay? But for example, intercourse was one of them, okay? And the term sex was reserved to talking about male and female differences, right? To talk about people, not an activity. Are you with me? Well, okay, once you start using this term sex to refer to the activity, it becomes really awkward to use it in other ways because you might be misunderstood, right? Like even my talk, did you notice the title of my talk? If the title of the talk today was something like Why Sex is Good, you would think I'm talking about the activity, wouldn't you? 100%. Maybe you'd have a bigger audience. I don't know. But the point is, you would all intuitively think that, wouldn't you? Okay? Well, that's the kind of subject you don't want to be misunderstood. Yeah? That's really awkward. That makes for some awkward conversations if people think you're talking about the activity when you're not. So what happens is English speakers want to they try to find a different word to talk about sexual differences between male and female, and gender takes over for this term, sex. Now what's important about that, and the reason I'm giving this little sort of history lesson, you're thinking this is wonderful, I did not come here for a grammar lesson though today, is because when you think about the term gender, when it's used grammatically for things like nouns, right? Gender is basically arbitrary, right? So in Greek, the word for earth is feminine, but the word for heaven is masculine. It's more or less arbitrary, right? Other terms, other nouns in Greek are the same way. There's no rhyme or reason to why one is masculine and one is feminine, right? Well, that's one of the things that happens with this word gender. It gets attached to this idea of our male and female differences, and some people actually love it precisely because in its previous use, gender was considered arbitrary. Are you with me? That's actually one of the reasons why. So one of the first people to ever use the term gender role was a guy named Dr. John Money in 1955. He was a psychologist who worked at Johns Hopkins. He's infamous now because he did one of the first sex change operations in a young boy. It totally ruined this kid's life. Both this kid and his brother committed suicide as a result. I won't get into that. But he wanted this term precisely because it seemed to disconnect male and female differences from our bodies. And that was his whole idea, was that our differences are totally arbitrary, and they're totally disconnected from our bodies. Are you with me? And I would say that's exactly why we're in the problem we are today on this issue, is because people have disconnected these two things, what it means to be male and female, from our bodies. And what I want to do this morning to you is bring those two things back together and say, no, you actually cannot separate them without doing real damage to people, okay? So I'll give you a quote on this from Alan Jacobs. Alan Jacobs is an English professor who teaches at Baylor University. He says, the sense of arbitrariness embedded in the term gender is a perfect fit for a society like ours that wants to disconnect these two things. He says, indeed, perhaps this is why gender emerged as the preferred substitute for the term sex, to describe what male and female are. And he goes on to say, therefore, to talk about our current debates as debates about gender is already to concede the most essential point at issue, which is the question, are maleness and femaleness rooted in biological reality, or are they basically arbitrary signifiers? Do you see that? To even use the term gender, you've already sort of surrendered too much, right? So now, again, I just want to be clear. It's impossible to avoid the term gender, I realize, okay? But I do want you to be aware of how often that term is used in a way that is different from the way I'm going to use it today, okay? I want to try to bring these two things back together where I think they belong. Okay, so that's sort of a bit of throat clearing. Sorry for that. Okay, so here's the big idea, okay? Here's where we're going. Here's what I want to argue with you this morning. I'm going to try to argue and convince you that as God-given gifts, our sexual differences, as I said, are real, important, and good. All right? Real, important, and good. And we'll come back to this idea of them being God-given gifts. Okay? Because that's going to get to our last point, and that is we flourish when we honor those differences, and we suffer as human beings when we deny them or denigrate them. when we try to pretend like they're not real, all right, we actually suffer as a result. All right, so that's where we're going. So let's start then. In this first talk, I want to talk about why sexual differences are real, okay? And we'll start with kind of an objection, right? Not everybody agrees with this, all right? Or at least some people think maybe they're real, but they really just don't matter that much. We'll talk more about that in the next one, okay? But many today, I think, would say something like, sexual differences aren't really real. They're just social constructs. I'm sure you've heard this term, right? They're just social constructs. They're habits or customs that have learned and been shaped by societal expectations and norms, right? So why do girls like pink and boys like blue? It's just societal expectations, right? It's a social construct. There's no reason why girls should like pink and boys should like blue, all right? Now let me concede a little bit to this objection right at the beginning. Men and women do have a lot in common, don't we? Like, we share a lot in common. Just think of the obvious. We both have 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 hands, 10 fingers, right? 2 eyes. Like, go down the list. There's a ton of things we as men and women share in common with each other, right? We are both human, right? I know, married couples especially, sometimes it feels like your spouse is of a different species, yes? Okay, but the reality is we're all the same species, aren't we? We're all human beings. We have a lot in common, all right? And even just go beyond sort of the anatomical similarities, think theologically for a minute. The Bible teaches that both men and women are made in God's image, so that both men and women have all the same dignity and value that follows from that. Both men and women are given the task in the book of Genesis to be fruitful and to exercise dominion over God's creation. We both have souls, don't we, that are eternal. We both have hearts that are made to love God and to glorify Him. We both, unfortunately, fell into sin, don't we, and need a Savior. There isn't a Savior for men and then a separate Savior for women, is there? There's not. As the Apostle Peter says it in 1 Peter 3:7, we are heirs together of the grace of life. Okay, so I want to start by that and saying, look, of course, there are a lot of things we have in common. Let's not deny that, okay? But today I want to focus more on the differences because that's where I think our culture is most confused. I don't think our culture is particularly confused about our similarities. I think our culture tends to be confused about the differences, okay? And let me say one more thing up front about this objection, okay, to kind of just clear out a common misconception. Oftentimes people will use the fact that men and women express their masculinity and femininity differently in different cultures as a way to say the differences don't exist at all. That they're, like I said, sort of cultural constructs, right? So think of an example, like in our culture it's not normal for men to wear skirts, right? But somebody might say, oh, but if you go over to Scotland, actually lots of men wear skirts and they tend to wear them on special occasions, like for celebrating, right? Like weddings and stuff. See, it's totally arbitrary. But I want you to think about this argument for just a second and the problem with it, okay? I'll give you an analogy that I think will help you see it. I don't know if you know this. I didn't know this from experience, but in the U.S. military, okay, you show honor to your superior, your commanding officer by saluting, right? They also do this in the British military. However, in the U.S. military, you salute with your palms down. And in the British military, you salute with palms up. That is a genuine cultural difference, isn't it? Right? I don't know what the consequence would be, but I suspect you'd get in trouble in the British military if you started saluting with palms down, right? That's arbitrary. But think how silly it would be if somebody said that because the way those two militaries express honor, therefore honor itself is not real, right? Wouldn't you say, no. They're different ways of expressing the same thing. And that's what I would suggest to you is true when it comes to cultural differences, which are real. It really is true that men and women act different and dress different, right? From culture to culture. But in fact, if you look at every culture around the world and throughout history, they have always had ways of distinguishing male and female, haven't they? Oftentimes in things like dress and behavior and expectations. So think of my example of a skirt, right? You might say when you compare Scotland and the US, men here don't wear skirts, men there do. But you know what women don't do in Scotland? Women don't wear kilts in Scotland, do they? So even the skirt wearing, if I can put it this way, is itself in Scotland an expression of sexual difference, isn't it? Even though it's sort of the reverse of what it is here. Nevertheless, because only men do it there, it's still actually an expression of sexual difference, all right? So that just sort of clears some of that out. Now, what I'd like to do, if we could, is this is one passage I would like to look at you with, okay? Turn if you have a Bible. If you don't, it's okay. I think there's one in the pew in front of you, okay? But I want to show you how the book of Genesis, when it talks about the creation of male and female, emphasizes both the similarity and the difference, okay? The similarity and the difference, okay? So if we start at Genesis chapter 1, okay? We won't read the whole thing. But looking at verse 26, the text says, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.'" So God created man in his own image. Now that means humanity there, okay? God created humanity in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, that is humanity. Male and female, he created them. See that? There's one humanity, which he can refer to in the singular as him, okay? But then that humanity is in two parts, two halves, if I can put it that way, male and female, right? And God said to them, and God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth." All right? So as the pinnacle of God's creation, after he's made all the animals, right? After he's separated the waters, he's created land, he's created lights to rule the day and the night, he creates mankind as the pinnacle of his creation, and he makes them in two parts, male and female, right? There's similarity, they're both human, right? There's similarity, they're both in the image of God. There's similarity in that they're both blessed with this task of multiplying and of ruling over God's good creation. Then flip over to Genesis chapter 2, all right? In Genesis chapter 2, we kind of zoom in on the creation account of humanity, don't we? All right? And I won't read the whole thing, okay? But we get the creation we get special attention drawn to the creation of male and female, all right? And what I want to draw your attention to is verse 18. We'll read from there, okay? Because I love this part of Genesis 2. So after God has made the Garden of Eden and put Adam in it, okay, verse 18, "Then the Lord God said, 'It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him.'" All right? Now this word "fit for him" is a unique combination of two Hebrew prepositions. One literally means something like him, and the other means opposite him. It's a wonderful combination of both similarity and difference. I'm going to make a helper for him that's like him, but opposite him. Like and opposite together, okay? Now what I love is you expect the very next thing to be the creation of Eve, but it's not. Instead, you get what I call Adam's trip to the zoo, all right? Out of the ground, the Lord God had formed every beast of the field, and that's interesting because God had made Adam out of the ground as well. You might think, oh, if he makes all the other beasts out of the ground, these must be the ones that are fit for Adam, right? They're made from the same stuff that he is. They're also earthlings, if I can put it that way. Now, out of the ground, the Lord God had formed every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all the livestock and to the birds of the heavens and every beast of the field. But, see the but? But for Adam, there was not found a helper fit for him. Do you see what happens? God essentially says it's not good for man to be alone. And that's the first time something is not good in Genesis. Before this, everything has been good, right? Day 1, it was good. Day 2, it was good. Day 3, it was good. Then you get here and man is alone, and it's not good for him to be alone. Why? He needs a helper to do what? To care for creation, right? To subdue it, and to be fruitful and multiply. So you think, okay, great. God makes all these animals out of the ground, just like he made Adam from the ground. Surely one of them is going to be right for him, right? And so God does this parade of animals, right? And says, Adam, why don't you name all these? And the idea is God wants Adam to see very concretely that none of them is fit for him. They're definitely not like him, right? Remember that I said that term fit for him means like and opposite? Like him, but different from him? He's got to be looking at the animals and going, these are definitely different, Lord. The giraffe, that's an interesting one. Had not seen that before. The rhino walks across, right? He's like, okay, that's very clever, right? The platypus, he's like, ooh, I don't even know where that one goes, right? But he gives it a name. But none of them fit him. None of them are like him, right? So God wants him to see, if I can put it this way, his loneliness. He wants Adam to see he cannot do it by himself, right? So what does he do? The Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall on the man. While he slept, took one of his ribs from his side and closed up its place with flesh. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. Then the man said, here's something different. That's just the right kind of different, right? The perfect kind of different. Like me in all the right ways and unlike me in all the right ways. So he gives this little poem. This is wonderful. This at last is bone of my bones. Quite literally, he made Eve from his side. And flesh of my flesh, she shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. And then Genesis draws our attention to the fact that this similarity and difference, this perfect combination of similarity and difference, explains marriage for us, doesn't it? God doesn't want Adam marrying a giraffe. He wants him marrying Eve. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh, right? Only a man and a woman can unite in this unique way where they become one flesh, right? And what happens when they do? They also become fruitful, don't they? And they multiply. So you see what God has done is he's designed the perfect counterpart for Adam. If you think about it, if all God wants Adam to do is be a great farmer, right? And subdue creation, give him a friend. Give him a really good friend. Helps if, like really muscular, let's add that, okay? Like a really muscular, tough guy, right? These two guys, if they're good friends, two guys working together can get a lot done, can't they? Give Adam a group of male friends. But that's not what he needs, is it? He can't be fruitful if God gives him another man. He needs something that is the perfect combination of similarity, another human being, not an animal, but different, a woman, someone he can be fruitful and multiply with, right? Now, as we'll see, as we go on, then in Genesis chapter 3, one of the things Genesis wants us to see is all the ways that God's perfect creation goes wrong with sin, right? So if we were to go back into Genesis 2, we would see that God designs Adam to protect the garden, and he designs Eve to be Adam's helper. And one of the great tragedies of the fall account in Genesis 3 is that Eve, the helper of the man, helps him to sin, right? It's so tragic. She's been designed to help him, and she does help him, but she helps him sin. And Adam, who's been designed to be a protector, does not protect her from the serpent, right? Have you ever wondered this? Like, when God puts him in the garden, he says, protect it and keep it. Who's he supposed to protect it from? And then you get to Genesis 3, and you're like, oh, I see now. Maybe nefarious creatures who are tempting my wife, right? That's exactly who Adam should be protecting and what he should be protecting them from. All right, so that just gives us some basic biblical foundation, and again, gives us the sense of, yes, it's true, it's right to see that there's so many similarities between male and female. Of course there's tons of those, and we should rightly talk about those and celebrate those too. But there are also important differences, aren't there? And those are good too. So let's talk then just a minute, shift for just a second with me, okay? If our differences between male and female are God-given, and they go all the way back to creation, why is it that we live in a culture that seems so often to want to deny them, to downplay them, all right? There's a couple reasons for this. One we'll talk about in the next talk, which is technology, and it's the way it's influenced the way we see male and female. But I want to suggest to you that one major reason is because we live in a society, in a country that really loves equality, right? Now, I'm not against equality, okay? However, we need to think carefully about how our society often defines equality. And I want to suggest to you that today, the dominant way that Americans think of equality is in terms of sameness or interchangeability. Interchangeability, right? So that if two things can't be interchanged, we say they're not equal, and that's a bad thing. It's a negative thing. If two things are different, we say that's a bad thing. We need to make them more similar, right? Well, that creates an immediate problem, doesn't it? Because we've just said God made Adam and Eve to be different. He made male and female to be different. That's a good thing. And if we're pursuing equality, and by that we mean sameness or interchangeability, we have a problem. Because men are not the same thing as women according to God. Right? Women are not the same thing as men. They're designed to be different. All right. Here's another reason I'll give you. You could probably come up with other reasons, by the way. We can talk about this in the Q&A if you want. But here's another suggestion I would offer you as to why we live in a culture that is tempted to deny it. I think if we're honest, sometimes not sometimes, but I think our sexual differences come with responsibilities baked in. And sometimes those responsibilities can feel like a burden. What do I mean? Haven't you ever thought, ladies, that it does not seem fair that women have to bear the burden of childbearing? Right? Now, giving birth is okay. Keep in mind, I don't know from personal experience. Let's just be clear. But I've seen my wife give birth 6 times, and it seems like an incredible experience. But it's this incredible experience that as a man, I'm kind of like, I'm okay for you to experience that. Right? If we're honest, men, ladies, you're all like, yes, of course. So it's this incredible gift to be able to give birth, but it's kind of a burden, right? I mean, I remember being a first-time dad, and my daughter was born. It was this incredible experience, right? Absolutely life-changing. And then it's like, then I'm kind of looking at her going, and what do I do? Right? Or every dad has felt this during his wife's first pregnancy. It's 9 months of like, what do I do? You know? Can I just tell you personally, one of my great disappointments, my wife is an amazing woman. But there's one disappointment that she's given me, and that is that when she's been pregnant 6 times, she's never once had a good craving. Do you know what I'm talking about? She never once was like, wakes me up in the middle of the night and says, honey, I gotta have pickles. Go get me some pickles and ice cream, right? I just wanted one, and 6 kids, and I've not gotten one. You know why I wanted that? Because as a man, I'm like, what am I doing here? She's creating this life with her own body somehow. It's like magic. And what am I supposed to do? I just wanted one thing to do so I could feel a little important. Do you know what I mean? I just wanted one craving, and I got none. All right. That's my only complaint about my wife. But sometimes the differences don't seem fair, right? They can feel like a burden if we're honest. It doesn't seem fair that men should have to die in war or give up their seat on the lifeboat, does it? It doesn't seem fair sometimes that men have so much physical strength that they can use against women, right? That doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem fair maybe to men that women have so much, if I can call it this, seductive power over men. A kind of power of beauty that no man has over a woman. It's true. My goodness, I have my second youngest is a girl. We've got 3 girls and 3 boys. And she is blonde as you get, blue-eyed as you get, as cute as a button. And this girl came into this world fully aware of her powers over her dad. Do you know what I'm talking about? Fully aware of her powers over her father. I'm hopeless, folks. Pray for me. Right? That doesn't seem fair sometimes to men, that ladies, you have this kind of power of your physical beauty that we don't have. So I think sometimes it's tempting for us to want to deny these differences because they are really different. And they can feel like a burden. They can feel unfair. Finally, I think we need to say, sometimes because of our estrangement from God, because of sin, we have a deep-seated insecurity that makes us constantly turn all sorts of human differences into threats. Don't we do this as humans? And comparisons become the occasion for envy. That's true of anything, right? It's true of your neighbor's house. It's true of your neighbor's car or his job. But I think it can also be true of sexual differences. Where if we're honest, sometimes we look at the opposite sex and think, that doesn't seem fair. And we might even envy what the opposite sex has that we feel like we don't. G.K. Chesterton, the British author, once wrote a poem in his notebooks about the silliness of trying to compare different things and treat one as better than the other. Right? This is what we do. Two things are different, but we're always, as human beings, constantly stacking them. One is better than the other. And he's saying, how silly is that? He says, if I set the sun beside the moon, and if I set the land beside the sea, and if I set the flower beside the fruit, and the town beside the country, and if I set man beside the woman, I suppose some fool would talk about one being better. Do you see what he's saying? What's better, the sun or the moon? At some level, what a stupid question. You're meant to appreciate them both for their differences, right? And we know that's just a temptation of all humans face, right? So I think those are some of the reasons why as a society we are tempted to deny the differences. But I want to suggest that we really can't. We really can't. The differences are actually undeniable. And I think even still today, as much as we try to emphasize equality and sameness and interchangeability in our society, we actually still know there are differences and they're real. So for example, biologically speaking, just start with that, men have 10 to 20 times the amount of testosterone that women do. It's a very clear binary. If I were to chart most of the differences between men, like height, for example, they would be two bell curves and they would be overlapping. Okay? So at the far end of the spectrum, the tallest people in the world, they're all men. The shortest people in the world, they're all women. But there's a whole bunch of us in the middle, right? And it's super easy to find a woman that's taller than a man, right? On average, men are taller than women, right? By the way, in general, women prefer to marry a man who's taller, but there are exceptions, of course. But this binary, or these two graphs, as you can see, they're a clear binary. There's no overlap at all. And testosterone is one of the most important differences biologically between men and women. I don't think I put it on your handout, but there's a great book on this by a former Harvard biologist named Carol Hooven called T, The Story of Testosterone, the Hormone That Dominates and Divides Us. She's not a Christian, and the book is certainly not a Christian book in all ways. But it is fascinating to read it and see all the ways that testosterone explains the differences between men and women. Men, our male aggression is largely a factor of testosterone. Right? We'll come back to that. But testosterone, obvious one. Okay. Now, certainly, as I said, society's done a lot to treat men and women interchangeably, but again, the differences are unavoidable. Here's some other things. Think about violent crime. Men commit 90 to 95% of murders worldwide. This is not a cultural difference. This is worldwide. Now, ladies, I just want to be clear, okay? This does not mean 90% of men are murderers. Okay, let me just be very clear about how these stats work, okay? But it means of murderers, 90 to 95% are men. Why? Because of male aggression. By the way, most of the people that men kill when they kill are other men. 80% of thefts are done by men. Carol Hooven says in her book on testosterone, the more risky, extreme, and cruel the violence, the larger the sex difference and the greater the proportion of male offenders. I happened to look up stats from the Federal Bureau of Prisons this week. It says 93% of all inmates are male. Does this mean all men are bad? No. I'm not saying that at all. Right? But I'm again just saying, if men and women are the same, shouldn't this chart be 50-50? Should be. And shouldn't it be different from country to country? It should be. But it's basically the same on every society. Driving. We all know men and women are different drivers. I'm not going to make jokes about women drivers. I'm not, I promise. But it is true that women cause slightly more accidents than men. Not a lot more, but slightly more. However, men, I'm going to be an equal opportunity offender here this morning, don't worry. Men tend to cause more severe accidents. Why? Because men are risk takers, right? When you hear those cars speeding by at 80 miles an hour at 1 in the morning, you can bet good money it's a man driving it, right? It is, because we take risks. We like speed. We like fast cars. Home-work-life balance. How about that? Gallup did a poll in 2015 and asked people who had children under the age of 18 at home. 72% of the men they polled wanted to work outside the home compared to just 39% of women, right? Are there women who still want to work outside the home with kids? Yes, there are. But the difference is pretty stark between men and women, right? Career choice. This is a big one. This is a big one. You would think that countries that have more political equality for women would have more equality in job choice, yeah? It's the exact opposite. The more modernized a country is in terms of the political, economic, and educational opportunities for women, the more women choose stereotypically female jobs. Again, these are generalities. Obviously, there are plenty, loads and loads of exceptions. But the more they choose professions that stereotypically appeal to women, if they live in a country with more opportunity. Women in general prefer jobs that involve people, and men prefer jobs that involve things. Again, there are plenty of exceptions, but these are generalities. But let me ask you, again, we know this, but we tend to deny it. When was the last time, those of you that work in an office environment, when was the last time you had an HR manager that was a man? When was the last time your plumber was a woman? When was the last time you saw an all-female road crew fixing a road? Is your garbage collector male or female? All right. Here are just some stats from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, okay? Here's some of the highest percentage female occupations. HR managers are 76% female. Psychologists are 78% female. Social workers, 88% female. Pre-K and kindergarten teachers, 96% female. When was the last time you had a male kindergarten teacher? Very rare. Speech therapists, 94%. Okay, here's some of the highest male jobs. Repair occupations, 96% male. Truck drivers, 90%. Civil engineers, 83%. Computer engineers, 94%. Now, here's the problem. Because our society thinks that equality means we've got to have half and half, we're sort of trained to hear those numbers and think that must be bad. And I just want to say, why? Are there benefits to having male kindergarten teachers? There are. And maybe that's a bit unbalanced. We might want to balance that out a bit, right? But there's nothing inherently wrong with that. So even a society like ours that really prides itself on pursuing equality, right? The differences are still clear. Again, because the more opportunity women have in a society, the more they choose professions that are stereotypically female. All right. We can give other stats. I'll skip some of these, but there's other things. We could talk about divorce. Women file for divorce about 70% of all divorces. In same-sex marriages in England and Wales, this is the one that really gets me. If men and women are the same, you should expect gay marriages and lesbian marriages to basically be the same, right? Because men and women are the same. If you put two of each together, it's the same either way. It's not the case. In England and Wales, over a 5-year period, lesbians accounted for 70 to 75% of all same-sex divorces. Isn't that interesting? Now, we could theorize about why that is. I don't know, okay? But I do suspect, I'll give you one suspicion I have, okay? This is from my experience as a pastor in part. Women tend to be far more sensitive to relational problems. And thus, I think they tend to be more intolerant of them. So I'll just from my personal experience as a pastor. Now, I have learned over the last 3 years of being a pastor that if I ask a man how his marriage is going, I should also ask the wife. Do you know why? Because most times I'll get an answer from the man that's something like this. Well, we had a fight last night, but I think it's okay. We made up. I think we'll be fine. I go ask the wife about that same fight, and she's distraught. She's like, it was a terrible, do you see what I'm saying? Men will tend to be like, I think it's bad, but I think it's okay, right? And women, I just think, are more sensitive to relational problems. That can be good and bad. Again, we're different in ways that are good, but we've got to try to honor those differences and find the way we complement each other. Okay, last thing I'm going to say for this talk, and then I'll give you a break, okay? There's one objection that comes up often in this discussion about differences. What about intersex people? What about intersex people, okay? Don't they prove that sex isn't real, or at the very least that sex is not really a binary? There are not two genders, right? There's a spectrum, and not everybody's male or female, okay? I don't want to get deep into this, and I don't claim to be an expert on this, but more and more, I've read on this, people are trying actually experts are actually avoiding this term intersex altogether, okay? Because there really is no one who is between the two sexes, between them. So what have until recently been called intersex conditions are now often have been renamed what doctors will call disorders of sexual development. And they are real, and they do present problems sometimes, especially at birth, where you may think a baby is one thing, and it does turn out to be the opposite. But here's what's really interesting about these disorders, okay? They tend to actually, well, they don't tend, they reinforce the binary. Do you know why? Because some of these disorders only affect men, and some of them only affect women. Now, they do affect them in such a way that you can have a boy who may look like a girl in certain ways, or certain things don't develop as they normally would. Are you with me? And same things on the side with a girl. So we should have compassion on these. And they are medical conditions, and there are various ways that doctors try to address them. And like I said, I'm not an expert on this, so I'm not trying to give medical advice or something like this. But I just want to say that oftentimes you get in these kind of conversations, people will say, well, you believe that there's only two sexes, but what about intersex people, right? As a kind of like a gotcha. It's not a gotcha at all. If anything, intersex conditions, which are real, okay, and again, it's better to call them disorders of sexual development probably, but actually they reinforce the fact that men and women are different, right? Even though they do cause real difficulties for the people that have them, okay? All right, so what have we said in this first talk? I'm going to give you a break here in a second, okay? All I've tried to do in this talk is address the question, are sexual differences really real? And I wanted to convince you, yeah, I think they're really real, and we really can't deny them, right? And unfortunately, we live in a society, in a culture that oftentimes does want to deny them, right? And sometimes that's totally fine, right? There are plenty of places where our differences don't matter, and we'll talk about some of those, okay? But then there are places where they really do matter, and that's what we want to try to do in the next few talks, is think about, okay, in the next talk, we'll think about how are they important, okay? And what are they? We'll dive a bit more into that, and then we'll look at ultimately why they're good. All right, let me stop there and give you a break. Let's take a 10-minute break, so we'll come back at like 5 to 7 after, okay? And I'll stick around here. We're going to do a Q&A at the very end, okay? So if you've got questions, you're welcome to save them for that, but also try to hang around in the breaks if you want to come up, all right? Thanks very much. Get started again. All right, thanks for hanging with me in that last talk. I know some of that was a bit high level, all right? But what I want to do now is take us a step further. Again, keep in mind, I'm trying to keep this real simple. There's so much we could talk about. And hopefully a lot of the things if there's something you're going, why isn't he talking about this? Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. I don't know. But you're welcome to bring it up in the Q&A, okay? And I'm sure some of the things I'm going to say here are going to raise questions, and I'm happy to address them. All right. So with this second talk, here's what I want to do. I want to go a step further. If we're willing to say, no, okay, the differences are really real, we can see why there's, temptation to deny them, and why our society tends to want to do that. But we have to be honest and just say, no, the differences are real. Some people would say, okay, fine, they're real, but they shouldn't really matter. They shouldn't really matter, or maybe they don't matter. Or some might even go a step further and say, well, yeah, the differences are real, but if we focus on them, that's just going to be a way for one group, usually men, to oppress the other group, usually women. Right? So this would kind of be your standard feminist response would be to say, okay, we're willing to admit that there are real differences. We just don't think those differences should matter. And the way those have historically mattered have been bad. Okay? So we'll talk about that last part, are they bad or not, in the third talk. But for now, I just want to think with you about, are they important? Do they really matter? And also, we will answer the question like, what are they? I will do the seemingly impossible this morning. I will define what a man is and what a woman is. Okay? But before we do that, I want to talk about why I want to defend our culture just a little bit, okay? Because I actually think there are some good reasons why it's easier for our culture to believe that the differences aren't real than it has been for any people in history. Can I say that again? I think there are some good reasons why our culture actually does not see the differences as clearly as previous people have, okay? They are technological, and I'll explain them. But to begin, let me give you how I want to do this, okay? Oops, not that one. Let's see, maybe I want to go 2 more. Yeah, no, I'll come back to that. Okay. Let me use an analogy, okay? In Psalm 19, you don't have to turn there, but in Psalm 19, the psalmist is looking at the stars in the sky, and he's amazed by them, all right? And he recognizes that God is speaking to us through his creation. Okay? The psalmist says, the heavens declare the glory of God, the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. All right? He's saying, when you look at the heavens and you see that big, bright yellow sun up there all day, that means something. And when you look out at night and see billions of stars and a moon there, that means something. God is speaking to us about who he is. He says, there's no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. In them, God has set a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom leaving his chamber, and like a strong man runs its course with joy. The sun's rising is from the end of the heavens, and its circuit to the end of them, and there is nothing hidden from its heat. We know that all too well, don't we? There is nothing hidden from the heat of the sun in the summer in Arizona. It's especially true here, okay? There's certain things in the Bible we can just appreciate better than other people. But did you hear what he's saying? He's saying the heavens are always talking to us. God is always speaking to us through them. And there's something really important. This is essentially what theologians call natural revelation, as opposed to special revelation, which refers to the Bible, right? God speaks to us in the Bible, obviously, but he also speaks to us through creation. Christians have always believed this from passages like Psalm 19. But it's really interesting that the psalmist appeals to the stars. I just want you to think about creation. Maybe think about your favorite place to go in creation, where you maybe are most aware of God's existence. Maybe it's up in the mountains for you. Maybe it's the Grand Canyon. Maybe it's whitewater rafting. Or maybe some of you are like, I don't like to be outdoors, so it's your home. Okay? But think about what part of creation. And the psalmist doesn't appeal to those. He doesn't appeal to the incredible long neck of the giraffe, does he? He appeals to the stars. Do you know why? Because the stars are universal. No matter where you are on planet Earth, the stars are there. The sun is there. Yes, granted, it's hotter here in Arizona, okay, than it is, up in Oregon. We know that. But it's still the same sun, yeah? And you can still see it. But that's not true of other parts of creation, is it? We couldn't say to somebody living in Africa, go to the Grand Canyon and look at the glory of God, because they live in Africa, right? But whether they're in Africa or Arizona or anywhere in the world, everybody can see the heavens. Does that make sense? They're everywhere. And God is always speaking to us through them. He's always communicating about himself, all right? But there is a problem today that we have that the psalmist did not have. What is the problem? Well, let me put it this way. In the summer of 2016, a group of scientists published a new set of world maps. They were not charting new shipping routes or plotting unknown parts of the deep sea. No, these new maps were depicting the world's light pollution. Light pollution. And the news was not good. The map showed that some 80% of Americans can no longer see the Milky Way. So that's a map of the U.S. You can see kind of the light, where the light is, okay? And here's what the lead researcher of this study said. He explained what we lose with light pollution when we can't see the stars the way we used to. He says literature, religion, philosophy, science, and of course the arts all have roots connected with the contemplation of the night sky. He says we are the first generation that grew up without the possibility to see our place in the universe. Do you see what he's saying? You go outside at night here in Tucson and you look up and you see some stars, right? But you see far fewer than previous generations did because of artificial light. Are you with me? Now, thankfully, there's still places you can go, right? Like Flagstaff and other dark cities, and you can see it afresh, okay? But night after night does not look the same to you as it did to the psalmist because of artificial light. Now, here's the thing. Is artificial light good? Does it have benefits? Of course. Tons of, college students, how would you pull an all-nighter if you had to, light a candle? Right? It'd be a lot harder, wouldn't it? Okay? But now we can work when the sun goes down, don't we? The psalmist pretty much had to stop working when the sun went down, didn't he? His day was over when the sun went down. We could talk about some of the effects of that, but we won't. But here's my basic point. Technology has obscured the truth of God's creation. It's still there. Let me be very clear. The stars have not stopped shining, have they? Not in the slightest. Every single star is where it's always been, shining just as brightly, right? At least as it was for the psalmist. Okay, don't ask me about stars dying and all that. I have no idea, okay? But the point is the stars look basically the same. But because of technology, it's harder for us to see it. Are you with me? And I want to suggest to you by way of analogy that something similar is true when it comes to our sexual differences. That today, as a result of certain technologies that I want to talk about, we live in a unique time where just like we don't see as many stars as we used to, it can sometimes be harder to see what God is saying to us through our sexual differences. All right. So to do this, let me borrow from an anthropologist, okay? David Gilmour has written this very interesting book called Manhood in the Making, where he looked at societies around the world, all sorts of different, like modern societies and societies that are not like highly developed in the ways that ours is, okay? And he came to this conclusion. He said, basically, every society in history, no matter where they live, always has to overcome two basic obstacles: production and reproduction. Production, meaning you've got to make food and you got to make stuff, right? You got to have a place for your society to live and to function. That's production. But you've also got to reproduce, don't you? If you don't have babies, your society will not survive. That's pretty straightforward, right? We may not think about it in these two categories, but he says these are the two basic categories. And what I want to suggest to you is that throughout history, most societies have found that having men do most of the productive work is helpful, and having women do most of the reproductive work is helpful. And so sort of dividing the work is a great way to accomplish these two goals and keep society around. Are you with me? But something dramatic has changed with technology, okay, on both of those fronts. Both production and reproduction are dramatically different for us in ways they have not been for much of human history. All right, so I want to talk about production first. I won't go too far into all this, okay? But when we think about production, okay, I want you to think about your house, your home, for just a second, okay? I want you to think about what you produce out of your own house that you also consume. Now, what I mean by consuming is everything from like stuff you eat to like what you wear to like all your other stuff, like TV, your car, right? Like all the stuff, anything you use. How much of it do you produce at your house? Unless you live like on a farm, it's probably almost none, isn't it? It's not your TV, I'm sure. Unless you're a really good mechanic, you probably didn't build your own car, right? If I had to, Lord help me, if I had to feed myself with what I grow in my backyard. I've got one of these little box gardens, right? Right now it is in shambles, thanks to the summer that we just had, right? My whole family would not be eating if we had to feed ourselves on what I can grow, right? Okay, that's a huge shift. Because if you were to go back even maybe like 100 years in this country, a lot of what the average household consumes, it also produces. Are you with me? So what's happened is a massive shift where the home has gone from a place of production and consumption to one of just consumption, and everything is produced outside the home. Are you with me? Okay? This is one of the results of industrialization. Okay? Now, I'm not necessarily saying it's all bad. Obviously, I like driving a car. Okay? I'm not pining for some wonderful era in the past. Okay? This is probably a good point to stop and say, friends, since Genesis 3, there is no period in history where the two sexes have gone along perfectly and everything has been wonderful and we all sing kumbaya. Are you with me? Sin has affected every society. Yeah? We're not going to create utopia this side of heaven. That's not the goal. So I'm not saying if only we could get back to the 1950s or the 1850s. Friends, I don't want to go to a dentist in the 1850s. Do you? No. All right? There are some things I'm really happy for. But we just need to understand them and understand how they affect our view of the world around us. Okay? So Mary Harrington, in a book I think is on your reading list there, the book of reading, argues that industrialization in practice reduced women's economic agency in particular, driving a wedge between work and home that didn't exist before. Okay? Because before, women were in the home, but the home was also a place of production, do you see? It was a place of work. So she says, think about the kind of things that women tended to do in the home, right? It was things like spinning yarn or making cheese or tending animals or sewing and mending clothes, right? It'd be interesting to know, you don't have to raise your hands, but like, we may be like, there's probably some of you in this room who can still remember a time like when your mother sewed clothes for you. And like, my daughters are probably not going to learn how to sew at all. In fact, their grandma tries to teach them because my wife can't. It's a kind of a lost art. But I can remember a time where my mom still sewed clothes for us. It was kind of embarrassing, if I'm honest, because the clothes were not always the most stylish, okay? No slight to my mother, but, right? But there was a time where that was totally normal, all right? But industrialization changes all that. It takes the productive element of the home and takes it out of it. And what Mary Harrington says is it made what was left of homework, that women basically had a choice. They could either try to take what was left of homework, okay, and try to make it more visible and valued by society, or they could say, fine, there's nothing really happening in the home that's productive. I guess I'll follow the men into places like factories and offices. Are you with me? So that's a major change where industrialization has changed the nature of the home. The very fact that we can talk about women working in the home or staying at home as opposed to working, that's a pretty new thing, right? If you had asked, imagine like the pioneers who settled Arizona, right? If you could have asked those women pioneers, do you stay at home or do you work? They would have been like, what? Yes, I do both, right? Okay. Another part of this too is just another part. We don't need to get too into this, but if you think about capitalism tends to train us to think that if someone gets paid for something, it's valuable, right? We tend to associate value and money together, and if you can't attach money to something, it must not have value. So stay-at-home moms suddenly start to feel like their work at home is not valued. Why? Because it's not paid work. I remember during COVID, I always hate to use COVID examples because it's like, who wants to go back to COVID and remember those times, right? So forgive me for this COVID example, but I can remember during COVID when everybody was getting laid off from jobs, and I would hear on the radio all these stories about the number of, the percentage of people getting laid off from work and how a large percentage of that group was women workers, right? And the response to that was, in a number of cases, very explicitly from like the president was, we've got to get these women back to work. The assumption was if they're not working, they're not a value to society. No, I never heard a single story on like NPR or any major media that said something like this. Said something like, yeah, the bulk of these people losing their jobs are women. I wonder if that might be a good thing, actually. Could there be any positive that come? It was just assumed that it could only be negative, right? Why? One reason is because we tend to associate money with value. So if somebody is doing a job that they don't get paid for, like a mother, for example, we tend to think it's not as valuable, right? Dorothy Sayers, the British author, she said this, thinking about this dramatic change. She said, it's all well and good to say that a woman's place is in the home, but modern civilization has taken all these pleasant and profitable activities out of the home, where the women looked after them, and handed them over to big industry to be directed and organized by men at the head of large factories. Even the dairymaid in her simple bonnet has gone to be replaced by a male mechanic in charge of a mechanical milking plant. See what she's saying? She's saying it's good to say that women should be in the home, but you've taken everything out of the home that was productive about it, right? So why are you surprised that women would maybe want to leave it? All right, we can come back to that because that raises all sorts of questions. Right now, I just want to present it to you as something we need to think about. One of the ways technology has shaped the way we think about men and women, okay? In ways we're sometimes maybe not aware of, okay? All right, now think about reproduction. This is maybe the bigger one, okay? Reproduction. We are the first generation in history to have reliable contraception. And I would suggest to you, if we had more time, I would make the case to you that the invention of the oral contraceptive in particular, which was approved by the FDA only in 1960, so it hasn't been around that long. I realize it's going on 60 years now, but I would suggest that probably the invention of oral contraception may be the most consequential invention in history, actually. Okay, that's pressing a bit far. Can I at least say one of? One of. You're thinking, what? What are you talking about? How could it be that important? Well, think about some things that are distinctive, in particular of oral contraceptive. Now, contraceptive has been around forever in various forms, okay? But oral contraceptive does three distinct things that other forms don't do. First of all, oral contraceptive is a contraceptive that can be taken outside the moment, if I can put it that way. Okay, that's key. Second, it's entirely in control of the woman, unlike other forms. Okay, condoms are very different. I won't get into it, but you can figure it out. You can also stop taking it, so it doesn't have to be permanent. Okay, and if you think about contraception, particularly the pill, okay, the oral contraceptive, it's the first major medicine that was invented that didn't actually cure something that was wrong. Yeah? If you read this, you don't have to, but this is a really fascinating book if you want to read it. by this guy named Jonathan Eig on the history of the pill. By the way, I don't know if you know this. My hotel last night, I don't think Mark intended this, but it was like 2 miles from Margaret Sanger's house. I don't know if you know Margaret Sanger. She's the founder of Planned Parenthood. She lived in Tucson for about 30 years. Margaret Sanger is one of the major proponents of the contraceptive pill. She's the person who invented the term birth control. There were other options. That was the one that, how could I put it? That one was the best marketing for the term. She had other terms that were not good, okay? But listen, Margaret Sanger realized the significance of the oral contraceptive. Here's what she said. In his book, he says this: Margaret Sanger's campaign for birth control would give women control of their own bodies, such that womanhood would no longer mean the same thing as motherhood. Do you see that? She disconnected the two, and she knew it. Her goal, her explicit goal, was sex without pregnancy. And that's what the pill does. It makes us think that sex and pregnancy have nothing necessarily to do with each other. Now, I say they make us think that because the reality is quite otherwise, isn't it? There is still only one way that we produce that you get a baby, right? Okay, I won't go into the details, but I suspect you know what I'm talking about. So the pill, and other forms of contraceptive too, not just the pill, but other forms of contraception, teaches us to think, for example, of women as naturally infertile, and therefore obscures the very point at which men and women are most obviously different, right? And in some ways, most significantly different. Pregnancy is a big deal, isn't it? It's a really big deal. Any woman who's gone through it most women that go through it are very surprised at what a big deal it is, right? If you read the book by Mary Harrington, she was a typical liberal radical feminist, and she will say in her book, what changed her mind was getting pregnant. She says, I was shocked. She says, before I got pregnant, it was easy for me to think that women and men are basically the same, and that the goal of life was sort of autonomy, to never be too tied down. She says, then I got pregnant, and all of a sudden I realized how this other life was totally dependent on me, right? And it totally changed her whole view of things, right? Now, I'm not saying there's no benefits like with artificial light. Are there benefits of artificial light? Yes. But does it affect the way we see creation? Yes. And what I'm suggesting with both of these changes, I'm not saying they're inherently bad, but I'm saying we need to be wise to the ways that they affect the way we think about the world around us. Okay? That's my basic point here. Okay? There are a number of things I could go into if we had more time to talk about the significance of contraception, but let me just give you one that often surprises people a lot. Okay? Most people expected that when we got reliable oral contraceptive, unwanted pregnancies would dramatically decrease, right? But the opposite happened. When the oral contraceptive, after it was legalized in 1960, the abortion rate went up and up and up and up. Now, it has just recently started to dip a little bit, but it has gone up since the invention of the pill, not down. And you should expect it to be the opposite. How does that happen? Couple reasons. One, because the pill is not always effective, right? It has like a 99% effective rate, even when you use it properly, right? Okay, well, what happens is suddenly you have a lot more people having a lot more sex outside of marriage, right? Well, if that success rate, if the effective rate of the pill is still only 99%, you still have a lot of unwanted pregnancies happening, right? And in fact, you have more than you had before. So the pill actually increases the number of unwanted pregnancies, right? The other reason is because obviously, as we know, sometimes any kind of contraceptive can fail from human error, right? If you don't use it properly, okay? But that's the thing, that people start to disconnect in their minds the idea of sex and procreation from each other, yeah? And then you end up with a lot more people pregnant who didn't want to be or didn't intend to be. And what's the backstop for contraception? Abortion. It's not an accident that the pill was legalized in 1960, was approved in 1960 and legalized shortly after. But abortion was then legalized in 1973. Again, more contraception leads to more abortion. Why? Because it leads to more unwanted pregnancies. All right. There's so many other things we could talk about the significance of the pill. Okay. When I talk about this, though, I find that people often react this way. People are often shocked to think that something they hardly ever think about could be so significant. Can I suggest to you that not thinking about contraception is one of our problems? That actually is our problem, is the fact that we take it so for granted, right? You can ask me more about that if you want in the Q&A. That probably raises all sorts of questions, okay? But one of the other things that contraception does is it tends to make the male, if I can put it this way, the male experience of sex the norm. Why? Because men have always had sex and not gotten pregnant as a result, right? Like, this is basic biology. The pill allows us to start thinking that must be normal. And that's sort of the norm. And then women want to have the same experience, or at least that's what they're told. Are you with me? But it's never actually been that way. Babies have always been made through sex, haven't they? Right? But it is one of the places where men and women are most different, in that no man has ever gotten pregnant after sex, and women often do. There's so much I could say about this. I don't want to overwhelm you, but let me say one more kind of surprising thing. When contraception came along in the 1960s, and then abortion with it in the 1970s, one of the things that changed dramatically in society was basically the death of what we used to call shotgun weddings. Some of you are too young to even know what that means. What is a shotgun wedding? You probably don't know hardly anybody who had a shotgun wedding. Well, let me explain for those of you who don't remember what this was, okay? It is not the case that we are somehow inherently more sexually promiscuous than people in the past. Friends, no. The sexual drive has always been what it is. There has always been temptation. Are you with me? Okay? Technology has played a role, don't get me wrong, in changing our morals. But people have always had sex outside of marriage. But what happened in the past was two young people had sex before they got married. The girl got pregnant, and what did society do? Society and family stepped in and said, okay, man, you have an obligation to marry her. And we call this a shotgun wedding, right? You can, sociologists have traced this. You can trace a clear, not just correlation, but causation between the increased use of contraception and abortion and the complete drop-off of shotgun weddings. Now you might say, well, maybe that's a good thing. Well, here's the problem. It teaches men, in particular, that they have no responsibility for the babies they create. Because you know what every man can do, every young man now? It used to be a young guy gets his girlfriend pregnant, and society says, okay, man, now you're going to marry her and take care of the baby. You got to take responsibility for your actions. Now he can say, I don't have to take responsibility for my actions. She has the responsibility. She didn't take the pill, right? She should get an abortion, right? He can now push all that responsibility more onto the woman. Do you see that? So the very thing that Margaret Sanger thought was going to free women, yeah, it's actually freed men. And in particular, it's freed promiscuous men from having to take responsibility for their sexual actions, right? But again, one of the ways that the pill has shaped our view of the sexes. All right. Again, more we could say, but let's move on, okay? I do want to talk about what are the differences. If it's true that technology, in particular something as big as the industrialization and then something as tiny as the pill, has shaped the way we think about men and women and their differences, and is one of the reasons why we're able to deny their differences, even though they're still there, what are the differences, okay? Now listen, we are talking about differences across the population here, okay? There are 8 billion people in the world. Some of the differences I'm going to suggest, okay, you can find exceptions for. You may be the exception in some cases, right? All right, so just keep that caveat in mind. All right, men and women are different. But what is a man and what is a woman? Here's my simple, before I do that, sorry, I forgot. Okay, I want to take you to one other verse before I do this. I love this verse, okay? This is Proverbs 30, verses 18 and 19, okay? Because one of the things I'm going to do here in a minute is I'm going to give you a list of like masculine and like male and female traits, like psychological traits, okay? And sometimes people see those lists and they hate them, right? Like if you're an atypical woman or an atypical man, you can see that and you're like, oh, I hate that. People always expect me to be like this and I just don't fit in, right? Okay. So let me alleviate some of that for you with a verse that I love. Okay, here's Proverbs 30, 18 and 19. 3 things are too wonderful for me, the writer says. 4 I can't understand. The way of an eagle in the sky, the way of a snake on a rock, the way of a ship at sea, and the way of a man with a young woman. Okay, now you're like, what do those have in common? That's why he says 3 things are too wonderful, 4 I can't understand. The 4th one is meant to be the one you really think about. But you think about it in relation to the other three. What do those three things have in common? The way of an eagle in the sky, a snake on a rock, and a ship at sea. What I suspect they all have in common is they all move in very mysterious ways. Would you agree with that? Like, haven't you ever, you may have to go back to when you were a child, because now you've gotten old and you don't care anymore. You don't notice these things. But don't you remember when you were a kid and you had that experience of seeing a bird just soar through the air effortlessly? You remember this experience? And you thought, how does it do that? And then if you were young enough, maybe if you were just a boy, I don't know, you had the second question, you were like, I bet I could do that. Right? And then you're like, you learn the hard way, like, no, I can't. It's mysterious, isn't it? It's like wonderful. Like how does that bird do that? There's nothing, I can't see anything underneath it, and it's just floating. It's moving up and down in these incredible movements. And if it's an eagle, man, then you see it, catch some prey, and you're just like, that's unbelievable. Or same thing with a snake. Haven't you ever looked at a snake and gone, how does that work? There are no legs that I can see. How is this creature moving this quickly and this terrifyingly, maybe? And then think of a ship on a sea. You look at the way the ship moves across the water. It's not sinking, is it? It's leveraging the water and the wind to move. And you go, that's amazing. And then the writer of Proverbs says, now think about the way of a man with a woman in the same way. Do you see the differences between men and women? The reason why the list I'm going to show you in a minute is going to feel like stereotypical and reductionistic even in some ways is not because the differences aren't real. It's because the differences are so much more than what you can put in a simple list. Are you with me? Like a simple list is going to be too simplistic. If I were to describe a snake, its movements in a simple table, you would look at it and go, that doesn't capture it. You've missed all the wonder of it, right? The mysteriousness of it. Listen, married couples, haven't you thought this about your spouse? I do not understand this person. She is a mystery to me, right? He is a different kind of creature. I cannot explain him any more than I can explain how an eagle flies through the air, right? And when you watch a young man court a young girl, same kind of thing. Sometimes it's very awkward, yes? But there's something beautiful to it, isn't it? Where you see these two different things come together. Sort of like with all these things. Flying, an animal in the air, mid-air, that's bringing two things together that are surprising, right? A ship on the sea floating and it's moving. That's two things that are unexpected. And yet, the wonder of it is precisely them coming together, right? So I just wanted to say that before we get into the list, and some of you are going to feel like, this is too simplistic. Of course it's too simplistic, because the differences are way more than I could put in a table. They're wonderful, they're mysterious, they're fantastic, they're awe-inspiring, all right? As Lindsey Wilson says in his commentary on this verse, he says, life is both hard to understand, yet a wonder to explore. Isn't that a good way to think of the opposite sex? Hard to understand, but a wonder to explore the differences. A young man comes into contact with a girl that he's attracted to, and he's like, he can't explain why he's drawn to her. He's drawn to the fact that she is different from him, and he wants to try to figure it out. Same thing with a young woman who's attracted to a young man. All right, so here's just some differences, okay? Paul Vitz, he's a psychologist. I think he taught at NYU for a long time. He went through a bunch of the literature on psychological differences. He gave a list of 10 things. I've just given you some of them for space. What I like about his list in particular is that for each one, he gives positive and negatives. Because what can often happen with these kind of lists is you get the positive one on the one side and then only the negative one. So it's like all the positives of masculinity, all the negatives of femininity, right? Or vice versa. And no, we don't need to do that, okay? But men are assertive. This goes back to what we talked about with testosterone, right? Men are assertive. Negatively, they can be domineering, though, right? Women tend to be nurturing, but think about the way that can go bad with a woman who infantilizes the people she, say, works with or is around. Men tend to be risk-taking. They can be rash. Women tend to be more careful and timid, right? Have you ever YouTubed these videos, why women live longer? You just find, they're amazing, right? It's just video after video of men doing very stupid, dangerous things. We know this about men. Men, it's because of testosterone. God made us this way, to take risks. It's a good thing. Can it be turned for bad? Absolutely. But in its proper place, it's a really good thing. I like to give this example, okay? Last time I gave this talk, I gave this example. Like, have you know this thing that all dads do when they become parents, where they take the baby, and when the baby gets to the stage where the baby is starting to use its legs, and dads do this thing, they all do it. You know what I'm talking about? They hold the baby by the feet, and then what? Do this thing. Do you know what I'm talking about? Right? Balancing the baby, not letting it fall, right? Seeing if it can stand on its legs. Men love this. Have you ever seen a mother do that with her baby? I've never seen it. I put this on Facebook last time I gave this talk. While I was giving the talk, my wife left the first comment. And she basically goes, yeah, I wonder if it's because like the mother has just carried this child in her womb with her own body. But isn't this exactly right? Of course women are more sensitive to the child's protection. Look how much she's put into it. She literally transferred her life into its. Whereas the guy is like, yeah, but let's see if it can do this. We're just like that, right? We are different. So men have a kind of mental toughness, but that can lead to insensitivity. Women tend to be very sensitive to others, but they can sometimes be easily hurt, right? So just, again, you could think of your own. You could make this list longer. Again, is this exhaustive? By no means. Does it capture everything? Of course not. Any more than you can capture the wonder of a snake moving on a rock. The differences are way too wonderful and extraordinary and even complex for us to capture in a very simple list. All right, so what does it mean then? What is a definition of a man? Here's my definition. Can you improve on this? Probably. Go for it. See if you can, okay? What does it mean to be a man? To be a man is to be a mature male, okay? Who is the kind of person who is ready to be a father, providing for and protecting for those in his care, right? Now, does it mean every man has to be a father? No, it does not. You can be a man and not be a father. But to be a good man, a mature male, means the kind of person who's ready to do it, who's ready for it, right? I talked about Gilmore's book. One of the things I love in that book, he says, most societies have this interesting feature that's true of masculinity that's not true of femininity. He says most societies that he studied, men have to sort of prove themselves as a man, and women don't. Women are just sort of taken as they're women, and they're women, and they're women. They're born women, and they are women. But men have this, every culture has this way of sort of making men prove that they're a man, right? And he says, how do they do it? If he were to summarize it in one way, he says, a boy becomes a man when he can provide more than he consumes. Young men, let me encourage you this morning. That is a great way to think about maturity as a man. Are you doing what you need to do now so that if you should say become a father, you would be able to provide for those under your care? Do you produce more than you consume? And when you do, you're ready. You're a man, right? It's a good way to think about it. All right, to be a woman then is to be a mature female who is ready to be a mother, nurturing and caring for those in her care. Does it mean every woman becomes a mother? It does not. Whether through infertility or not being able to find a husband, many women will not become mothers, just like many men will not become fathers. But nevertheless, motherhood and fatherhood tell us about masculinity and femininity in really profound ways, I think, that help us think about it, okay? Let me say a couple more things about each of these, okay? What it means to be a man. Just some things I picked up along the way that I think are like really helpful ways to think about, like, what does it mean to be a good man, okay? I want to give you my favorite one. Now, ladies, before I give this, I'm going to tell you, okay? I have what I think is this great encapsulation of what it means to be a good, mature man. I do not have a great little quip for the female side. If you think of one, come tell me, okay? Come tell me. All right, it won't surprise you that I'm a little more familiar with the male side of being a human, okay? But I love this one, okay? There's a guy named J.F. Roxburgh, and he was the head of a boys' school in England for a long, long time, okay? So he's experienced a lot of masculinity, a lot of testosterone, okay? And when someone asked him, what is he trying to do in running a boys' school? Here's what he said, and I love this. He said, I'm trying to create boys who will become men. The kind who would be acceptable at a dance and indispensable in a shipwreck. I love that description. Do you hear it again? Acceptable at a dance and indispensable in a shipwreck, right? Friends, it's no accident when the Titanic sank, 19% of male passengers survived compared to 75% of women. Because it was a boat full of men who knew what it meant to be a man. To say it's my job as a man to protect to provide for others. So you get in the lifeboat and I'll stay on the boat. That's what a good man does. And what I love about his addition of acceptable, now look, gentlemen, let's be honest, okay? Let's not kid ourselves. Most of us are not going to find ourselves in a shipwreck, are we? So ladies, before you go and scoff and say, oh, that seems unrealistic, that's a stupid way to think about it. Yeah, it's true. Okay, probably most of us are not going to find ourselves in shipwrecks, but you want to be the kind of man who would be indispensable if it were to happen. Does that make sense? That's the way to think about it. To be a good young man, okay, let me put it this way, is to get a no from a girl, okay, at a dance. I don't know. Do you still go to dances? Don't answer that. I don't know how. I'm getting too old. I don't know how these things work anymore. Okay, but to get a no from a girl to dance and still be trusted enough to get her home safely after. Ladies, isn't that the kind of man you want? Aren't those the kind of men you want to be surrounded by? Good men who know their strength. They're not embarrassed by it. They're not pretending that they're weak when they're not. They know their strength, but they use it to serve and protect and provide for others, and they can be trusted, right? So you get a no from a girl, but in other words, what I'm describing, right, is what we used to call a gentleman. Isn't that what we're describing? Someone as concerned with preserving the dignity and safety of others as with his own. That is a good man. And men do often do this, right? We can think about, one way to think about sort of differences between men and women is to think about the ways they go right and the ways they go wrong, right? We just marked another anniversary of 9/11, right? I think 9/11 is one way you can see this so clearly. The men who flew those planes into buildings, they had a kind of manliness, if I can put it this way, yeah? But it was destructive, wasn't it? The men who were the firemen who ran up in that building and sacrificed their lives, they also had a kind of manliness, didn't they? But it was the good kind, right? Think about the way a man's manliness goes wrong when he abuses his wife. What makes abuse of a husband abusing his wife so awful, so particularly awful, in a way that, say, if a woman is beating up on another woman, is just not the same? Because we all know when we look at a man beating up on a woman, we say, that's just so wrong. You're taking the very thing that should be good about you and twisting it, right? The very people you should be protecting with your strength, you're harming with your strength, all right? Now, again, as I said, forgive me, I've got more to say on manhood than kind of womanhood. But if we think about womanhood and what it means to be a woman, as I said, to be a mature female who's ready to be a mother, nurturing and caring for those in her care. A good woman is one who can endure the pain. Think about what a mother does. This is incredible to me. Like I said, I've seen my wife do this now multiple times. It never ceases to amaze me. Endure the pain of childbirth, right? Men, just going to warn you, okay? You are tough. You have a kind of masculine toughness. It is good, okay? You have never experienced something like birth. Women have a kind of toughness you will never know. But here's what's so wonderful about it. It's accompanied with a kind of softness. So think about a mother who gives birth, this, traumatic experience of pain and difficulty that takes tremendous courage, and then almost immediately you watch a new mother goes from that incredible pain to what? Nurturing and caring for that baby. Isn't that incredible? That's incredible to think about how a mother does it, to go so quickly, to go from such pain to such concern for another is an incredible thing. And ladies, that's what you have. You say, I haven't been a mother, I haven't given birth. I know, but you're still a woman. And that is innate in you, to have that ability to nurture and to care, right? To be sensitive to the needs of other people in a way men just often aren't. That's a gift from God. Use it. Again, think about how the ways they can go wrong. I mentioned the example of a man who, say, beats his wife. Terrible. But think about the way a woman's gift as a woman can go wrong, right? When a woman takes her sympathy, her sort of natural God-given sympathy, which should draw her out to help others and be sensitive to their needs, instead, think about the way women are capable of emotionally manipulating other people, right? Women are able to emotionally manipulate in a way men cannot comprehend, right? It's not to say we're never manipulative men, I know that. But women have mastered it in a bad way, right, ladies? You've seen it in friendships. You know the way friendships go wrong. The way a woman will ruin the reputation of another girl at school, right? In just horrible ways. Again, what is that? That's the natural goodness of femininity, an awareness of a person's need, right? And a sensitivity to it, a kind of an emotional awareness, but then it gets twisted, right? Just like men can twist masculinity for bad ways, ladies, you can twist femininity in bad ways. All right, I'm going to say one last thing, and we'll take another break here, okay? There are any number of ways our sexual differences are disordered by the fall, ways that they can go wrong, right? And every society has them. We have them at both the individual level, and we have them at the societal level. But God loves us so much, he has not left us there, has he? And I don't want to leave us there either. There's one passage that I love. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, Paul is talking about how men and women should act in the church. And some of the ways that our differences as male and female should play themselves out in the church. And I won't go into all of them. But after describing Eve and the way that Eve was formed second after Adam as his helper, and that Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor, Paul says, but don't think that this means because men and women are different that somehow women can't be saved. That's a crazy conclusion to draw from what Paul says. Because he says, yet, despite the fact that Eve was the first to sin and became a transgressor before Adam, yet she will be saved through childbearing, if they continue in faith and love and holiness and self-control. What in the world does that mean? That's puzzled many people. What does it mean when Paul says that women, and Eve in particular, will be saved through childbearing? Well, go back to Genesis. If you read it carefully, one of the things you'll notice after the fall is that men and women are cursed differently. Right? Adam, because of Adam's sin, God says the ground is cursed because of you. And you'll still have to make the land fruitful, right? We still have to grow crops. I realize most of us are not farmers, right? But it's still true that all of us depend on farmers, do we not? Somewhere there is a farmer working the ground right now so that we can eat, right? We still have to make the earth that God made fruitful after the fall, don't we? Still a good thing to grow crops and make it abundant, but it will be harder, won't it? We have to do it now through thorns and thistles. The earth will not be productive the same way it was before the fall, right? There's a particular curse on creation because of the man's particular role in God's command to subdue the earth and to be fruitful and multiply. Then same thing for the woman, right? She will have pain in what? She'll have pain in the thing that is most distinctive to her function in fulfilling God's blessing to be fruitful and multiply, right? Folks, we can't multiply if women don't have babies. So just like the earth is meant to be fruitful as God made it and produce to bless humanity, so the woman's womb is meant to be fruitful and bless humanity with its fruitfulness and abundance, right? But both will now be cursed. Thorns and thistles for the earth, pain in childbearing for the woman. But God will take the very site, the very place of the curse, and use it to redeem us, right? Think about, this is a little bit of a stretch, this first one, but I think the second one is definitely fits, okay? Have you ever noticed how the Bible sometimes says that Jesus didn't die on a cross? It says he died on a tree. Yeah. What do trees grow out of? The ground. Trees grow out of the sin-cursed ground. You with me? How was Jesus born? Out of the sin-cursed womb of a woman. Do you see what God is teaching us in doing that? He's saying, male and female, you're different, and I designed you to be different in ways that are wonderful and that fit with the creation I've put you in so that you can rule over it and be fruitful and multiply and create more image bearers who bear my image. But then we sinned, right? And we sinned in some ways that are particular to our differences. The man who is supposed to be the protector fails to protect his wife from the snake. And the woman who is meant to be his helper fails to help him, or I should say helps him sin. And God says, because of that, the relations between you as men and women are going to be so affected by this, right? You're not going to get along. There will be a battle of the sexes that I never intended. But don't worry, a time is coming where I'm going to take the very source of your pain and turn it for glory, right? So the ground that bears thorns and thistles is going to produce a tree that my son will die on. And he will come into this world to save you through the sin-cursed womb of a woman. Isn't that like our God? To take the very problem and turn it against itself for our good and his glory. That's exactly what God does. All right, we're at time here. Again, just a reminder, what's been our overall point in this session? The first session, we looked at how sexual differences are real, right? And in this one, I've tried to convince you that they are important, right? They are significant. We actually can't deny them. In the third talk after this break, I want to talk to you about the ways that they are good. We've already been hinting at it a lot, I know, but I want to give it special attention. All right, thanks. So let's take a 10-minute break here. come back at about 5 after, all right? Let's go ahead and get started here with our last session, and then we will break for lunch, and after lunch you can ask all the questions you've been wondering about. All right. Thanks so much for your patience and your engagement. I've appreciated that very much. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about, something we've already kind of been hinting at, and that is the way that these sexual differences we've been talking about are good, okay? Because I think somebody could be listening to everything I've said so far and say, okay, fine, you've convinced me that they're real, even though, and there's some reasons why we don't see them the way we should, because of industrialization or the pill or whatever, or just our society teaching us to think about equality in terms of interchangeability and thus denying the differences. I'm willing to grant that they are real and important, but I think they're bad. Somebody might say, I don't like them, right? And so they might say, we should try to ignore the differences even though they're real, or we should try to mitigate them through law or economics or technology or whatever. Somebody might even say it's really good that women can now have sex just like men always could without worrying about getting pregnant, right? We should do that. We should encourage that. And now I want to kind of go for the jugular, so to speak, and say, nope, I'm going to come back and say, not only are the differences real and important, but I think they're really good, okay? And then with that, we're going to come to if you go back to our big idea, right? Our big idea was we flourish when we honor those differences, right? And we suffer as human beings when we either deny those differences or try to ruin them in some other way, okay? But before I get into that, I do want to suggest to you that kind of behind everything I'm saying about the goodness of our sexual differences is a belief that our sexual differences are a gift from God, all right? They are good, and like all good things, they come ultimately from God, all right? But along with that, like so many other gifts from God, they do come with responsibility. And I really like this quote from Flannery O'Connor. She's an author. She's a famous Southern writer. She wrote Southern Gothic fiction. And she's talking here actually about art, okay, and being a writer. But I think what she says here applies to other forms of gifts as well. She says a gift of any kind is a considerable responsibility. It is a mystery in itself, something gratuitous and wholly undeserved, something whose real uses will probably always be hidden from us. Usually, the artist has to suffer certain deprivations in order to use his gift with integrity. And I just want to suggest to you this today that that's one helpful way you might think about our sexual differences as a gift that do require responsibility and sometimes will require us to give things up that otherwise we might have. But that it's good for us to do those things. Just to take a quick example, being a parent will absolutely require you to give some things up. Yeah? No question about it. But being a parent has to be one of the great gifts that God gives, right? It's not the only gift. Singleness has its benefits too. But being a parent is a tremendous gift. Children are a wonderful blessing from God, right? But they do certainly require responsibility. All right, so what I'm going to do is, this last session, I kind of just want to go through a little bit of a shotgun approach and just give you some of the ways I think we can honor the goodness of sexual difference, okay? And this actually may end up being shorter than some of the other talks, okay? And that's okay if it does. But first, let me suggest that one way to honor the goodness of sexual difference is to honor the Bible and God's view of sexual union, or now we're going to use the word sex in its normal way, right? Honor it. Honor the Bible's view of sex as designed to bring the two halves of humanity together in procreative union. Friends, all of our traditional views of marriage, that it's between one man and one woman, that it's for life, that it's exclusive, all of those are easily explained when you realize that one of the fundamental purposes of marriage is reproduction, is babies, right? It's babies. Because all of our traditional views of marriage, again, that it's exclusive, that it's lifelong, that it's a man and a woman, are designed for the most benefit for the children that come as a result, right? If you're a child of divorce, you know, I read an article recently, I was telling my students about this, I was teaching on the Gospels and we got to Jesus' teaching on divorce, and I had recently just read this article by a woman. She's not a Christian as far as I know. She's one of 5 children of her parents, and her parents got divorced. And she wrote this article. It was not long, but this article went viral. And she's been a writer for about 10 years, and she said, this is probably one of all the things I've written over the years on all sorts of subjects, this one got the most reaction. The title of her article was Divorce Never Ends. And she was writing about all the ways that for a child, divorce never ends. And I'm a child of divorce, and I can tell you that is absolutely true. The adults may think it will end once the divorce is over and the parents have moved into different homes or something like that. It doesn't. Parents might think it ends when the child becomes an adult. It doesn't. When I had my graduation, I had to think, can mom and dad come to the same graduation lunch, or do I have to have 2? Right? And you start having to do that with everything. When it comes to holidays, which house do I go to? Right? When you have kids, which grandparent gets to see the kid first, right? It never ends. Lifelong marriage, as God designed it, is meant to protect the most vulnerable children. So honor the differences between us as male and female by honoring God's view of sex as designed to bring the 2 halves of humanity together, to produce new life, and to give that new life the absolute best environment it can have, the best shot at thriving it can have. Children need both a mom and a dad. Sociologists have been studying parenting for a long time, and they all agree. It's very rare that academics, if you're in college here, you know it's very rare that academics actually agree on anything. Sociologists agree that the absolute best environment for a child is to grow up with its mom and its dad. Not with a mom and a dad, but its mom and its dad, right? We'll talk about more of that in a minute, motherhood and fatherhood. But God's design for sex is meant to protect us and to keep us safe. Honor the Bible's view of sexual union as designed within the safe and protective confines of the marriage covenant. That's essentially what I've been saying. But also don't forget that marriage, as God has designed it, is meant to point us even to something more profound, and that is, as Paul describes in Ephesians chapter 5, the relationship of God with his people. Remember how Paul uses this analogy of marriage and tells husbands to love their wives and wives to submit to their husbands, and says, because God designed marriage to be a picture of Christ's relationship with the church, right? So why are husbands called to lay down their lives for their wives? Because that's exactly what Jesus did for his people, for the church, right? One of the things I think is really beautiful is if you look at the book of Genesis and the book of Revelation together, you realize the one starts with the wedding and the other ends with the wedding, right? The whole story of the world is a story of a wedding, right? It's of God's people, him making them for himself, for them to have a relational union with each other, right? But then one party, us, screws that up, right? Wants to leave the relationship, gets herself into a hot mess, and the husband comes and pursues her and wins her back to himself, right? You know why we love stories about knights in shining armor saving princesses? It's not because of the patriarchy, okay? It's because that's the story of the whole universe. God has made us to love that basic storyline because it's the storyline he's writing, right? Of his bride wandering away from him and him saying, I'm going to come get you, right? And I'm going to redeem you and bring you back. Another way to think about this is if we were to look at Genesis 1, many interpreters of Genesis 1 will notice that the 7 days of creation are broken up into 2 sets of 3 and then day 7. You've got 3 days here and 3 days here, and they kind of fit. And the way they fit is that, in fact, Genesis points us to this by saying that at the very beginning, the earth is formless and void. Do you remember this language from Genesis 1? The world is formless and void. And the first 3 days of creation are meant to form it. They're days of forming. And then the next set of 3 days are days of filling. So things like filling the seas that he had formed, now filling them with fish. Filling the skies, which he had formed, with birds, right? Filling the land with animals, and then ultimately humans and vegetation and all that, right? So forming and filling. And I would encourage you to think about that. This is a good way to think about male and female, actually. When we get to Genesis 2, it's not an accident we get another pair. Again, like sun and moon, or earth and sky, or heaven and earth, right? If you think about sort of the fundamental task of men, it's to form things. And then women fill them, I think it's like a wonderful way to think about the way we complement each other. And friends, you can probably see this in a church like this. You've got a church with male-only leadership, don't you? And I wonder if you've ever wondered about that. Isn't that unfair? Think about the male leadership of this church and other men as well. But they're kind of forming things, right? They're thinking of new ideas. They're thinking about how to solve problems, right? And I bet this church, because it's a good one, is full of women who are constantly kind of coming in from behind after the men are forming things, starting some new ministry, and filling it, right? I know that's how it works at my church. If we suddenly lost all the women at my church, nothing would happen. You'd have a whole bunch of men forming things that would be completely empty. Because that's what women naturally do. Think about the way a young couple, when they have their first child, right? The wife is pregnant, and the husband might start looking around, and he's gonna build the baby's bed, right? And he's gonna get the room ready in certain ways. He's forming. And what do women do when they're preparing for a baby? They nest. They're nesting, right? It's a form of filling. The mother is getting the house ready for the baby, right? Men tend to be outward looking. Women tend to be inward looking. That's a good thing. All right. So second, that leads us then to the second point. Honor motherhood and fatherhood as distinct and complementary. One author has said that dads tend to reflect the world. Moms tend to reflect the home. Mothers view the world in relation to the child. Fathers see their child in relation to the world. Dads, this is one of the things that's really unique about us that we're really good at. We're really good at pushing our children out into the world. It comes along with this testosterone stuff, right? And this fact that we like risk. We're constantly kind of pushing kids out into the world. It's one of the reasons why, like, just for some of you may identify with this, some of you may not. But when I first became a father, it was actually really hard because I just felt completely useless. It was like I couldn't do anything for this child, and it was really bad because my daughter, she would be crying, and I would try to hold her, and she would cry more. And I was convinced, my wife would keep telling me, she doesn't really hate you, I promise. And I was like, I believe you, but it doesn't feel like it. Okay, can I just tell you folks, newborns are not my thing. I'm not good with them. My wife's amazing, but when my kids hit like toddler stage, I'm all in. I'm like, I am dad and I'm ready to shine, right? Dad is ready to tickle. Dad is ready to wrestle. He's ready to throw him up in the air. He's ready to throw him in the pool, right? It's great because that's what dads do. We naturally bring challenges into our children's lives, right? To say, no, you can do it. To push them further. And meanwhile, what's mom doing? She's coming along behind. That's a little too much, Dad. Calm down, right? Maybe don't throw him so high, right? It goes back to this thing, right? Dads are putting their children at risk, and it's good for them. Moms are often a good control on that as well, aren't you, Mom? Okay? But that's what dads naturally do, and it's good for them to do that because dads are naturally preparing their children for the world, which is going to be a harsh place. It's going to come with risks. And if the child is going to grow up and survive and thrive in the world, the child needs to be ready for that, right? I love it. My daughters are now, they're running cross country. And this is like a new stage of dadhood for me because I love it. Like they want dad to be at their cross country meets. Do you know why? Because dad's going to yell at them. I'm like, come on, right? Like, you got to sprint. Now at the time they're like, Dad, shut up. But they get to the end and they're like, oh, that felt great, Dad. I'm so glad you, what? Pushed me. That's exactly what they need, and dads are particularly good at it. It's one of the reasons, the other thing that men do, fathers do, is they, especially for boys, they teach their boys to control their aggression. So that's why we wrestle with our kids, because what we're doing in wrestling, besides having a lot of fun, is we're teaching the children when too far, what too far is, right? Like, guys, my boys, I've got 2 girls, 2 boys, and then a boy and a girl, okay? It's super fun with these last 2 to see them side by side so close because you get to see the differences even more. But there's other things you get to see when you've got 2 boys close together, okay? Because I will come home from work and find my boys playing these made-up games. And one day I come home and I find them playing this game. I don't know what this game is called, and I, for the life of me, could not figure out how this game worked or what the rules were. Best I could tell, the game involved this, taking their shirts off and trying to scratch each other. This is as far as I could get in figuring out the game, right? Okay. But this is why it's so good for boys to wrestle with their dad, because in doing that, dad is teaching them, here's how to use your aggression, And hey, that's too far, right? Do you want to know one of the most common things that unites men who are in our prison system? Fatherlessness. They did not have a dad in the home who taught them when too far was too far. They didn't have a man around to teach them what is it like to curb that aggression and more importantly, to channel it into good, constructive ends, right? All right. So fathers then, lead, provide, and protect well with humility and with courage. You will, as the man, set the tone for your family for good or bad. Paul says in Ephesians 5, the husband is the head of the wife. He doesn't say the husband should be the head of the wife. He says he is. Husbands, you are a leader, whether you know it or not, and that will be for good or for bad. Make sure it's for good. It's a good job to have. Praise God for it. It comes with unique responsibilities and pressures. It does. Ladies and wives in particular, it's good to be aware of the natural pressure your husband feels to provide and protect for you. Encourage him in that. Tell him when he does a good job. He will respond so well to that, right? Mothers, nurture and care without resentment. Do not make men the measure of your worth. This is one of the things our society, unfortunately, constantly tells us to do. Ladies, our society is constantly telling you to measure yourself against men. So oftentimes, as we talk about the equality of the sexes, you say, equal to what? And the answer usually is, women, you need to be equal to men. Why, I want to say. Ladies, why should you want to be like men? You're women. Praise God for the ways that you're different. Don't constantly be looking for ways to be the same as them. Mothers in particular, you have a job that only you can do. A woman named Andrea Mrazek, I think is how you say her name. I think she was a lawyer, a very high-powered lawyer for a number of years. And then I think she got married and then got pregnant and had a child. And she wrote an article on her reactions to the way that motherhood changed her. And she said this, she said her long career didn't hold a candle to being a mother. And that being a mother, she said, is one of the greatest joys in life. This remains true even when, or perhaps especially, because it's not the easiest, right? And then listen to what she said. This is the line that really struck with me. This is amazing. She said, there's no other job I've had where someone else couldn't ably compete for it, except for that of being my daughter's mother. Do you realize that, moms? The corporate world wants you to think about life as a series of competitions that you need to come out on top of. And that can be exhausting if we're honest. It's exhausting. As a mother, and I would just go even further and say as a woman, it's a job only you can do. Why would you compare yourself to men? Don't waste your energy doing that. Look at the ways God has uniquely created you as a woman and the ways that you can be a blessing of that. Motherhood in particular is something we should honor. And I just want to say, with a lot of these guys, I think churches actually are really good places for this. Churches tend to do really well. As our culture clamors to treat men and women the same, churches can be almost like an oasis for people to come and go, no, I can come here, and as a woman, I'm not competing with all the men around me like I am maybe at my workplace, right? As a man, I can be a man and not have to apologize for it, right? But here's something C.S. Lewis said about the importance of motherhood that I love. Because one of the things that's happened in our culture is, remember I said that we tend to value things based on whether money is attached to them? So if moms, you don't get paid for being a mom. So our culture tends to not value that as highly. I think one of the things we need to do as Christians and as churches is up that value. Church should be a place where moms are really highly valued for being moms, even though there's no money attached to it, right? Okay. But listen to what Lewis says. He says, I think I can understand that feeling about a housewife's work being like that of Sisyphus. Do you remember who Sisyphus was in Greek mythology? Sisyphus is the guy who gets punished by having to roll the stone up the mountain. And every time he gets close, it rolls back down. He has to do it over and over, the same task over and over again without any real progress. Moms, this is what you call laundry. Right? That's exactly how you feel doing laundry if you're the person that does laundry in your house. It never ends. And just when you've gotten it all done, right? And you've put all the clothes away, 2 days later, you're right back in front of the washing machine, right? There's any number of things we do, both as moms and as dads, but they can feel so monotonous and unending. But listen to what Lewis says. He says, I can understand that feeling of a housewife who thinks she's Sisyphus, doing this unending work that's going nowhere. But he says, motherhood is surely in reality the most important work in the world. We wage war in order to have peace. We work in order to have leisure. We produce food in order to eat. So he says, your job as a mother is the one for which all others exist. Right? Think about it then. When you've got a house, and I know not all homes are like this, but a house where dad is working and mom is staying home with the kids, especially when they're little, right? Dad is going out to work. Is he going out to work to escape the family? Hopefully. Okay, now dads, let's be honest. Occasionally, when they're little, yes. But that shouldn't be why we do it, is it? We go out to work precisely to provide for the family. And if mom's staying home, she's doing it precisely for the family. But again, our society tends to think that if you're not working, you're just not that much value. We need to say as Christians, that's utter nonsense. We're both working for the home. We're both working for the family, right? All right. I've said a lot about marriage and parenthood. Some of you, a lot of you in the room are going, I'm not married. I might like to be, but it hasn't happened yet. So you're making me just feel bad. Thanks. No, we should also honor singleness for its unique blessings as well. Honor singleness sometimes comes with loss, especially if you're lifelong single or you're older, you're say past the point of childbearing years. It can be a real loss, but nevertheless, God provides blessings through the gift of singleness as well. And you're still a man or a woman. You may not be biologically a father or mother, but think about those things that I talked about, what it means to be a mother or father. What are the ways you take those same things and can develop those things and use them to bless others? So that if you're a single man, what are the ways you can right now, where you are, in ways appropriate to your stage and age, provide for and protect other people? And if you're a woman, what are the ways that you can use that nurturing that is innate to motherhood to bless other people, right? Keep in mind that if earthly marriage, as Paul says in Ephesians 5, is meant to point us to the gospel by reminding us of how Christ loves the church, singleness is important because it reminds us not to confuse earthly marriage with the gospel. Are you with that? Is that not a temptation, especially if you have a great marriage, to idolize your marriage and think this is the best thing there could ever be? No, friends. The best marriage there's ever been is only an echo of the best thing there is, which is Jesus. And singles, you have an important role to play in the church of reminding those of us like me who are married that my marriage is not all there is. It's not the most important thing there is. Jesus Christ and my relationship with him is the most important thing there is, right? Even the best marriage in this life is temporary, right? And singles, you have an important role to remind us of that in the church. Let me just say to the rest of us, friends, sometimes being single in the church can be hard, right? Single people can feel like second-class citizens. People can make them feel like they're a failure because they didn't get married, right? We should be really careful. Singles, sometimes people say weird things to you, like, how come you're not dating anyone, right? Be forgiving and kind to them when they say things that are awkward and make you feel bad. Keep in mind it's probably because they care about you and they know that marriage is a great blessing. You just need to know that God knows what's best for you, right? And he's not keeping anything good from you. He has your good in mind, right? So trust him. Young men, gentlemen, some of you may need a kick in the butt. You just need to ask her out, all right? Take that as a word from the Lord if you need it, okay? Some of you are single just because you're too scared. It's time to man up and just ask her out. She wants you to take a risk, gentlemen. She wants to know, does he think I'm worth the risk? That's why, do you know this is why? Again, this is not the patriarchy. Do you know why men are expected to ask the girl out and propose to her? Because the woman wants to know, is he willing to take a risk for me? It's a test. Pass the test. She may say no, it's true. And she knows that. That's why it's a real test. Okay, sorry. Now I'm giving dating advice. I need to stop. Sorry. That's for your youth pastor. Okay. All right. Second to last one. Honor the Bible's teaching on male authority in the church and the home. This one can open a can of worms. And so you can ask me about this in the break, and we could do a whole separate talk on this. Okay. But God has given men, especially as we've said, the job of protection, of protecting people, right? And that comes with a kind of assumed authority. Okay. Now, ladies, you don't have to submit to every husband. You don't. Okay. But all of us do have to submit to the men that are in authority of our church, the elders in particular, right? We want good elders who are good men, who use the power, the rightful power God has given them to protect us and provide for us. That's their job, right? We flourish when they do it well. So women, do not envy men for their leadership responsibilities, whether in marriage or the church. Do not view independence as one of your highest goods. Motherhood, for example, will definitely inhibit your independence, but it is a very good thing. Our culture often tells us to value independence and autonomy as the highest good. It is not. It's not. So don't buy the lie. Men, if you happen to be in a leadership position, whether as a husband or in the church, do not give the women under your care a reason to resent your leadership. Do not shirk your responsibilities. Level up in every area you can, men, right? You don't have to be CEO or captain of the team to be a man. That's good news for somebody like me, okay? You don't have to be the quarterback, gentlemen. Praise God, because look at this physique he gave me, right? Okay? I'd be done for, but I'm still a man, right? We come in different shapes and sizes, it's true, but a man is still a man. I can look for places where God has given me areas to exercise dominion in good ways as a man. I think of what Jesus said in Luke 16. One who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. Young men, you may not be married. You say, I don't have a wife to take care of and provide for. I don't have children that I need to protect. Okay, but where has God given you a little responsibility that you can step up and say, I'll be faithful in that, right? And that's true of women as well, right? We want to be faithful in very little. We don't have to be the quintessential manly man to still be a man, right? You don't have to be super athletic or whatever. No, you can look for smaller ways that are maybe less flashy, but still being faithful in your masculinity or femininity. So men, bless those under your protection and provision, and you too don't view independence as one of your highest goods. Church, lastly, there's a few pastors in the room. Okay, so this is just for the pastors or any elders in the room. Gentlemen, be as clear as a bell in this church on what women can and cannot do. You will serve the women well by being clear. Every church has to figure out where exactly to draw the line. Will we let women teach Sunday school for adults or not? Will we let them lead small groups or not? These are hard questions. There's no absolute in the Bible. You've got to use wisdom to decide. Work out your principle for deciding those things and then communicate it clearly. Most women I talk to, the most frustrating thing they can experience is a church that's super unclear. Many good, godly women will gladly submit to your leadership on this, pastors. But be clear. You owe that to them. You owe that to them. Be clear as a bell on it, all right? All right. Ladies, I should add to that too. Ladies, the fact that you don't have the high leadership positions in the church does not mean you're not important. And then you have an important role to play. And in particular, pray for your leaders that they would be good, godly leaders. And when you see something because you're a woman that you are more sensitive to precisely because of you're a woman, go tell them. There are things that we as men are dumb about. You're like, hey, okay, don't say amen. We don't need to say amen to that, okay? But you know it's true, right? Come tell them in godly ways, right? In humility, but just say, hey, I don't think you guys have noticed this, but I think it would really help the women in our church if we did X, Y, Z. If they're good men and godly leaders, they will be so glad to hear that. All right, finally, last thing, okay? Have discernment. I think this has kind of been underlying a lot of what I've been saying today. But we've really got to be more discerning about what our culture celebrates and the messages it sends us, right? Doesn't mean that everything our culture says about men and women is wrong. Don't hear me say that. I'm not saying that, okay? But be discerning. Start to listen for it. Start to watch for the ways that culture encourages us to think of men and women as interchangeable in ways that are not good, that downplay the differences and actually create confusion or hurt or harm. For example, our society loves to celebrate female firsts, right? The first woman Air Force pilot, the first, right? First woman president, if we get one, the first every, you know. Okay, but you know what that often means we leave out? Motherhood. No woman in this room is going to be the first mother. There's only been one first mother, and she's been gone for a long time, right? But that's one of the most profound things a woman can do. But you're never going to hear a newscaster go, we'd like to interview Sally now. She's the first woman to give birth. Not going to do that. Think about it. If you went to college and you have one of those alumni magazines, right? When was the last time they put a stay-at-home mom on the cover of your alumni magazine, right? Again, is it wrong to celebrate other things women do? Of course not. But look for what society celebrates. Be discerning. Society sometimes does not celebrate what we really should. It does not elevate what we should, right? So watch for that. Watch for what society ignores or denigrates or even sometimes denies. All right, last thing. I love this quote from Mendelberry because in some ways this sums up everything. Mark, can I pull an audible here? Okay, guys, we're at 35 after. It's very, 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 you can ask my students, super rare that I finish early, ever. Like this has never happened to me. So here's what, can we do this? Can we do Q&A now after I say this last thing? And then we all just go to lunch? Is that okay? And we get our afternoon back? That'd be awesome. Okay, we'll do that. So be thinking of your questions, but I'm going to leave you with this last quote that I like from Wendell Berry that covers a lot of what we're doing. He says, there is in practice no such thing as autonomy. Practically, there is only a distinction between responsible and irresponsible dependence. Friends, as male and female, we are dependent on each other. Listen to the words of Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. He says, verse 11, nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of a woman, and all things are from God. Do you see what Paul is saying there? He's saying, you might think as a man that you're independent of women, but you're not. Where'd you come from? Some woman had to sacrifice for 9 months to gestate you, your little body, and protect it and feed it and keep it safe. Then when you were born, you were as helpless as a person can be. And she took care of you, right? But then he goes back to creation, reminds the women, he says, but don't forget that you as a woman were made out of man. Why? Because God is showing us that we're interdependent, right? See how stupid it is when we fight? Doesn't the battle of the sexes now seem so childish and dumb? What a waste for us to use the differences that we have to fight with each other and try to one-up each other, decide who's better and who's worse. That's stupid, right? Instead, we're dependent. And then notice the last thing that Paul says. Not only are men dependent on women and women are dependent on men, so that we're interdependent of each other as human beings, but he says that last line, he says, and all things are from God, right? And that brings us back to our unity as human beings. Whether you're male or female, you are utterly dependent on God, right? And just like we flourish when we recognize our dependence on each other as male and female, we flourish the most of all, don't we? We flourish eternally when we humbly submit and recognize our ultimate eternal dependence on God, right? We are nothing without him. Everything good we have is a gift from him. All right, let me pray and close us, and then hopefully we'll open it up for questions, all right? Our Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the time you've given us this morning to think about these topics. Thank you for the willingness of these folks to come out on a Saturday morning and think together about these things. Lord, there's a danger that we might think too much about the differences between men and women, and that sort of consumes us, and we become obsessed with it or look for it in ways that we don't need to think about it. But it's good for us at times to step back and say, what a good thing you have done in making us male and female. We are all too aware of the ways that sin affects us and infects us, so that we can think of those differences as bad things or as oppressive or things we should try to fix. But in fact, Lord, they are for our glory and for your glory. So thank you for this time. Help us now in this time of question and answer, Lord. Help it to be helpful and bless us as we go on our way. In Christ's name. All right, we good? Okay. So let's open it up for questions. It looks like you've got a roaming mic. So if you've got a question, why don't you just raise your hand and we'll answer it. Who wants to be first?
Hi. Do you want me to stand up? Will that be easier for you?
No.
Okay.
Do what you want.
I am a PhD student in the U of A's Department of English, which is a very liberal, very secular world to be in.
I would guess, yeah.
And there's this huge pressure. Everything's about pronouns. There's lots of trans people in the department. So there's this huge pressure to kind of use pronouns to accept every and all gender identity expression.
Yeah.
And I'm just very scared, like, if I kind of express my views on those things, that I will be ostracized, that I won't be able to finish my degree because no one will want to work with me. And so I was just wondering if you have any thoughts, suggestions on how to like navigate spaces that are very liberal, very
That's
secular.
a great question. What's your name?
Grace.
Grace. That's a good name. Grace, that's a great question. The short answer is no, I don't have all the answers for that because I'm not an English major. And when I went to a secular school for my PhD, I was doing it in New Testament, so it was much more welcoming. Without wanting to presume, I can imagine that there's all kinds of craziness that you have to deal with, okay? So first, let me just acknowledge that you are in a tough spot, okay? One thing, recommend a book, okay? On your recommended reading on the back, there's a book by Abigail Favale. She is also an English teacher, and it was an English PhD. She did her PhD, though, in feminist studies, so she was even, in some ways, even more in the thick of it now. She did it about 20 years ago, maybe so. Things hadn't got quite the way they are now. But I think you'd be really helped by reading her book, if for nothing else, just to hear her story of kind of how she thought through a lot of this stuff and came out the other side. What I would say is, in general, look for ways. You want to think about two things. How can you be faithful to Christ in that difficult environment, okay? And then how can you love the people around you? Those would be the two things I would encourage you to think about. So your first loyalty is to Christ more than anybody else. And Jesus said, if you deny me before men, I will deny you before my Father. We want to be faithful to Christ even if it costs us. So ask yourself now, say, do I think Jesus is worth it? What am I willing to sacrifice for him, right? And think through that realistically, okay? Because I don't know, but it may cost you, and if it does, just know that it's worth it, right? It's worth it. But then think along with that, what does it look like to love these people and bear witness to the truth as God has revealed it? Where are there ways that you can present the truth that we've talked about today? Because at the end of the day, these people are ultimately harming themselves and other people by believing this stuff, aren't they? So the question is, how can you love them and help them come to see the truth? And like I said, I hesitate to give too much particulars just because I don't know your specific environment and each of them are individuals, aren't they, at some level? One thing I would say is it probably is going to require you to do extra reading, which you're like, I'm a PhD student, come on. I'm sorry to say that. But you are probably going to have to read more into this stuff, and you're going to have to read more of it than your peers here, even at church, are, because you want to try to love these people who are caught up in this, really this lie. It really is a lie at root, right? It's a lie that says that the sexual differences as God has made them are not real or are not good, and you believe they are, right? So you might have to kind of go beyond if I can say, go beyond the required reading in the syllabus to think creatively about how can you. Sometimes it may just be a matter of raising a question or suggesting something that they haven't thought about, right? There's this old saying that people say when it comes to unbelievers, sometimes you just want to put a pebble in their shoe, right? It's a pebble in their shoe. It's something that's gonna keep bugging you until you deal with it, right? Are there areas where you can sort of raise questions or bring something up that's gonna just put a pebble in somebody's shoe that's gonna force them to think about it after you're gone? So that's a great question, Grace. Thanks for asking that.
So, in general, though, when it comes to wanting to someone say, hey, I want to be known by these pronouns, like in general, again, each case is different, and the different costs and different levels of that. But in general, what would you say about that?
I think as a general principle, Christians should not use the wrong pronouns, okay? Why? Because it's involving us in a lie, right? And it's making us part of the game, if I can call it that, a game that is not true, and that it does ultimately bring harm to the people using them, but then to other people around them. It's actually not good for society to pretend like men and women are not real, right? It's not. People actually are going to get hurt by this and already are in some way. So it's not an innocent mistake, okay? Now, depending on the situation, you're going to have to navigate that carefully. My recommendation would be, and I don't know if this works because I've never had to do it, so keep this in mind, Grace in particular, okay? If a person is saying to you, you have to use my pronouns because that's my preference and that's who I am, you should be able to say back to them, well, it's my preference and my conviction that I shouldn't and can't. Because my loyalty is to Christ and to reality as I know it, and I can't lie. you would be asking me to lie. I know you don't think you're asking me to lie. You think you're asking me to just honor you and respect you. But in fact, I believe you're asking me to lie. So out of respect for me, I would ask you to respect mine. Do you see what I'm saying? You can kind of use that element of respect and turn it back on them and say, well, you're asking me to respect you. I'm asking you to respect me. And at the end of the day, and if it really comes down to it, this is why it's important. And I think this is actually why the pronoun things is an issue, because it's ultimately a power play. If you can force someone to use your preferred pronouns or whatever, it's a power move, and it shows that you have power. Then what you need to say in that moment is, I answer to a higher power. Does that make sense? So at some point, I don't know, it may not get to that point, but if it does, you just have to say, I can't. I'm loyal to God. How could I possibly disobey him in order to make you happy? So it's tough, but it's tough, and let's not pretend that it's not at times. Yeah. Got one right here.
Okay, I'm a teacher at a K-8 school, so I have kids all the way from kindergarten up, and I'm seeing more and more parents push the gender identity on their children very young. What do you think is the foundational lie, belief that has made them reject the gender of the sex of their child?
Yeah, I think it can be any number of things. I think one of them is this simple desire for autonomy, that we want to say what we are, right? So at root, it's a theological error. And I don't just say that because I teach at a seminary and I think everything's about theology. But I really think it's a theological error at root, where, look, the fundamental human sin is a desire to be autonomous from God and tell God who we are, right? Say, well, I get to say I'm this, and you have to answer to me, God. That's what Adam and Eve essentially are doing in the garden, right? Remember what the serpent says? God knows the day you eat of the fruit, you'll be like him. It's his desire to be in the place of God. And so at some level, like this desire to say what gender we are is just one more way in which we're trying to assert ourselves over against God and say, no, we get to determine reality. We're our own gods. Does that make sense? Which simultaneously makes your job easier and harder, doesn't it? Because now you realize you're dealing with a much deeper problem than just people who are confused about gender. But that's part of it. Yeah. Do you want to follow up? Yeah. 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 And what's sad about that, again, keep in mind, like there is a spectrum. Not all boys are the same. Not all girls are the same. Like some, like my 4-year-old, I said, this girl is like as girly as they come. She is all dresses all the time, right? Okay, but not every girl's like. Some of you girls grew up and you were tomboys, right? You probably grew out of it at some point, but you were. We don't need to freak out about that. If you got a boy who, I had 2 older sisters, guys. I played with Barbies, okay? Did I want to? No. Did I play with them differently? Yes. There was more death and destruction, okay? But still, I turned out fine. And unfortunately, what's happening a lot is this kind of attitude that children somehow innately know what's best for them. Folks, adults need to be adults. Children are children. Parents need to be parents. We're adults. It's our job to describe reality for our children and help them live in light of. So I think, the trans movement, when it's applied to children, is one of the most destructive, sad, in some ways demonic things ever. The way we're treating some of these kids, where they'll be infertile the rest of their life, is unconscionable. And I do think we're going to wake up pretty soon here. It's already happening in places in Europe, and I think it will happen here eventually. But people are realizing that's incredibly bad, especially at least the medicalization part in particular. So, yeah.
I just wanted to elaborate on the first question. I know you said you've never experienced having to be in that situation before, so yeah. I guess we'll just see what you think. Yeah. What if it wasn't what if they weren't asking you to use a pronoun but just a different name? Would you respond the same way?
Not necessarily. And I want to be clear, like on the whole pronoun things, guys, I think long-term that should be your aim, is to not use their preferred pronouns, but to use the pronouns that describe reality as it is, okay, just like with anything else. Because, look, guys, no one benefits by believing a lie long-term. Doesn't. Believing a lie is what got us into this mess in the garden, right? The serpent told a lie, and we believed it, okay? So that's a long term. But I do realize, like, life is complex, and there may be places where you go for a time, I'm going to do this just so that I can whatever, right? So that I can serve this person or keep an opportunity to love them and maintain a relationship or something. But name, might be a different one. That's tough because names are to some degree arbitrary. Now, part of it would depend, I think, maybe, like, what kind of a name change is it? Is it like, Bob to Josephine? Or is it like one of these names where it's already do you know what I mean? Like, some people pick a name that's intentionally ambiguous. That might be a little different. So I don't want to be like super, black and white, because life is complex and people are complex. And the people that have been, pulled into the whole transgender movement, there's all kinds of a mess. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So I wouldn't be like absolutely dogmatic, but I would just say in general, the question you should be asking is, how do I love this person? And the long-term answer is, you never love someone by lying to them. We love people with the truth, even if they don't like it. Doesn't mean we have to be obnoxious about it, right? Always, but yeah. So that's a good question.
Mine's more of a comment.
So. Okay. More of a comment. I'll take those two.
Do you think that the roles in church authority are only preferential towards men, or do you think that they're exclusionary against women?
Say that again. I heard.
Do you think that church authority should be exclusive to men, or just preferential to men?
Preferential. No, I do think in particular the role of elder is exclusive to qualified men. Okay, keep in mind, a man is not qualified to be an elder just because he's a man. There are many other qualifications that go along with it. But I do think because the role of elder, which I think is indistinguishable from pastor, in particular includes protection and provision as part of the job, okay? So remember, like, when Jesus asked Peter 3 times at the end of John's gospel, Peter, do you love me? And each time, what does he say? He says, Lord, I know you love me. And then Jesus says back to him, feed my sheep, okay? The language in the original is tend my sheep, which a shepherd's job is not just to feed, it is to feed, but also to protect, yeah? And so I think, yes, I think the office of elder in particular is restricted just to qualified men, and that's for the good of all of us. Deacon is a trickier one. There's been more discussion about that one in church history in particular. My own church has female deacons, and in particular that's because I think that deacon is not a role of provision and protection the way an elder is. So it's appropriate for one to be a deaconess. So yeah, lots more I could say about that, but does that make sense? Yeah. It's a great question. Oh, and I should tack on to that. Friends, that answer does not make us popular today. Does it? So as a church and as an individual, you need to sort that question out. Because people will tell you that is awful and terrible and oppressive and all the rest. But if what I've said is true about the difference between men and women, I actually think it's for our good, right? So I don't think God has designed women to be pastors. So ladies, you're not missing out because God hasn't designed you for that role, right? Any more than I'm missing out on being a mother. Is there a sense in which I am? I mean, again, I look at sort of my wife and think, I said my wife's had 6 kids. My wife does this thing with other women that I can never do, where if they've given birth, she wants to talk about their birth stories. Ladies, do you know this thing? I'll never be able to understand this from the inside, but my wife can sit down with a woman and immediately say, tell me your birth story, and they are like talking about their birth stories. Do you know what I mean? And I listen to it, I overhear it as a man, and I think, like, I don't think I want to give birth. Pretty sure I don't want to go through that. But honestly, what they're describing, it sounds like this incredible experience. Are you with me? I'll never have it as a man. I won't have it. And I just have to trust God that that's okay, right? There are certain experiences as a man I'll never have. That's okay. Ladies, you should never be a pastor. That's okay. By the way, most men will also never be pastors either, so you're not alone. All right. Sorry. Yes.
I had kind of a comment that will lead into a question. First off, just want to say thank you for the topic. I also wanted to say thank you for making it a positive conversation and kind of where my question is going. And I think a lot of people, and not to say that older folks who maybe are not in their career anymore don't also have to deal with this, but in our generation, and even more so for Gen Z, it is overwhelming. I mean, I'm sure for Grace, like, it's crazy. I'm an engineer, so I don't have to deal with that as much with it. But something as the church, when you look at like the LGBTQ community, that I see a positive trajectory for in terms of our response as a church is when you, and for me, you know, when I see the flag, like I get upset. My, you know, multinational corporation who builds missiles for the United States government flies this flag during June.
Yep.
You know, and it's really frustrating whenever we're supposed to be defending America and our allies. Anyways, where I'm going with that.
This is a comment. Go on.
So sorry.
It's okay.
Is last year in June, I have a lot of people that I respect in this area, and I don't know if you know Jackie Hill Perry, but she said something really great about like, hey, our heart should break when we see that rather than just be upset. And that has helped a lot with changing my perspective of actually wanting to love people and actually wanting to point them to the truth. So my question is more from a response perspective of, we've learned now that it's actually really beautiful and great that there's differences in men and women. What are some ways as Christians that we can respond to that in our culture and kind of apply that to our lives for people that don't know God?
And let's kind of just, if I can, just sort of add to that. The complexity is different for different ones of its different stages, right? So what is it like to raise a parent in this context? It's totally different, you know? For those of you that are over 40 or 50, you're thinking, when we raised our kids, we didn't have to deal with any of this stuff, right? Which gender are you? It was not even a question. And if you're a parent now, you do, whether you like it or not. So let me say a couple things. One is, I think there's a temptation for us, because we see the massive shifts that's happened in our culture, to feel resentful, like something's been taken away from us. A simplicity we've been robbed, you know? And now we have to work. Like, I remember my wife one time when I was preparing for this talk, the last time I gave it, and we were kind of talking, and she was just like, she just kind of lost it one minute. She's like, I'm just so mad that I have to care about this. Like, I don't have to explain to our daughters, like, what same-sex marriage is. And she was just like, and I was like, calm down, honey. It's okay. Like, but there is a place to mourn that loss of kind of innocence and simplicity, okay? At the same time, two things. One, like I said, there's never been a time where any society or people has had it all right when it comes to the relations. So don't pine for some era that didn't exist, right? The only period you're allowed to be really nostalgic about is the Garden of Eden, okay? I'll allow that. But otherwise, there's no perfect time, okay? But then second, I would say to that, okay, part of what we need to do as Christians is say, okay, God is sovereign, and he decides the times and places we live. Does God think it's impossible to be a faithful Christian in this time and place? No. You know how I know? Because he put us here in this time and place. I don't know why I wasn't born 100 years ago and didn't have to worry about this stuff. I have no idea. But he's put me here now, right? So even just like, sorry, Grace, I'm not going to pick on you, okay? But like, I don't know why Grace is probably going to have a harder time with this than others. I work at a seminary. Do you know what I mean? I have it as easy as it gets. Let me be very frank. Some of you are going to have it way harder than I do because of the environment you're in. Okay, you have two choices. You can feel sorry for yourself and get mad about it, or you can say, right, this is where God has placed me, right? I'm going to step up and I'm going to follow Christ in this. Does that make sense? So I do think that's part of it. Another part of it I could say, there's so much we could say about this, is where you have opportunities to do that thing I talked about, putting a pebble in somebody's shoe. So think about something like same-sex marriage. Sometimes we just have to think creatively about this stuff and think, how can we get people to think afresh about this stuff? Because they just absorb it from the culture. Listen, if you're just like a normal American person, okay, and everybody tells you that gay rights is the new civil rights, of course you're going to celebrate it. Right? Because if you don't, what are you? You're like, the people that supported Jim Crow. Nobody wants to be that person today. So of course you're just going to go along to get along. And do you see what I'm saying? Part of it, we should have some sympathy for people to realize they're just caught up in it, right? And we can understand that actually. But I get into this question of kind of putting pebble. I like to say to people, when it comes to same-sex marriage is supposed to be all about diversity, right? Except your marriages are all less diverse. Can I tell you about the real diversity of marriage? Is a man and a woman. That's as diverse as you get. You've taken all the diversity out of marriage. Two men together. Like in some ways, you think about same-sex marriage, you think, how does it get easier than that? I get along with guys easy. I understand the way they think. Do you know what I mean? Super easy. That's not diverse, and it's not beautiful either. Does that make sense? Male friendships are good, sure, but male sexual relationships, there's nothing beautiful about that, really. It doesn't bring two different things together in this beautiful union that's procreative, that brings new life and creates new life, right? The simple reason why is sex between two people of the same gender wrong? It's innately non-productive. It's never fruitful. It never produces new life, right? It is in that sense dead. So, all right, so a lot more I could say about that, but that's a start. Okay, sorry, Mark. Next. We got one in the booth, the sound booth, if we're allowed to take questions in the booth.
So this is kind of a statement followed by a question. I graduated from the U of A in the spring of this year, and something I noticed is a trend is they're so big on promoting diversity and inclusion and all these different things, yet as someone who's a Christian and a believer, when you start to promote or even speak on your truth and your values, you so quickly get labeled a racist, a bigot, a sexist, all these labels that you really aren't. So now as someone who has the opportunity to mentor college students who are walking in that same position I was in, what advice can I give to them to still speak and share their truth gently, while also keeping in mind that the truth that those people have is more subjective than the truth that we hold in our hearts?
Yeah, it's good. Okay, there's a couple things there. One is I would say we have to keep working to help young people see the truth of what we believe, so that what we believe is actually good for people and not harmful to them. Because nobody wants to believe things that are actually harmful to people, are we? Right? So great, like on your recommended reading on the back there is a book by a British feminist named Louise Perry. She's not a Christian, at least not yet, though I believe she is going to churches, so I'm hopeful. Get her book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. That's an incredible takedown of our culture's basic views about sex, okay? And how just more is better and you can do it with whoever you want. I mean, she's basically making the case for the Christian view of marriage and sex in that book, but doing it without ever quoting a Bible verse. And one of the things that's so remarkable in that book is that she shows in chapter after chapter how Christianity's traditional teachings on sex and marriage are designed to protect the most vulnerable, which is women. Okay? So if you think about like the prohibition against sex before marriage, you know the people that's most designed to protect? Women. Because of what we said, right? There's this dramatic asymmetry between men and women. Men never get pregnant, and women do. And you know what one of the most vulnerable places a woman could be, especially in the past, not as much today, but still very much today, one of the most vulnerable places a young woman could be is to be single and pregnant, right? We know one of the biggest correlations with poverty is single motherhood, right? Well, friends, can I just tell you, if we all followed Christian morality, we wouldn't have single mothers, would we? Or at least far, far fewer, would we? You want to eradicate poverty? You want to take care of the vulnerable? Follow Christian principles. So that would be one thing I would say is think carefully about the ways that actually Christianity gets to the goal that secular people are saying they want to get to, right? They want to protect the vulnerable and protect minorities and whatever. Like, show them how Christianity can actually get them where they want, and that where the way they're trying to get there is actually the opposite. All right, it actually produces more of the problem. So that's one thing. You just got to think. You got to think really carefully about reality and see through the fog, if I can put it that way. Then the second thing I would say is you're sort of mentoring young people who are in this situation, trying to navigate this. Is friends, we're in a time and place where we're going to have to really, well, put it this way: for a long time in this country, it was possible to be a Christian and that to be a thing that made you more respectable, not less. Right? And at least for some of us, depending on where you are, okay, it's not true for all of us. Again, like I said, I don't face this problem teaching at a Christian seminary. But for some of us, that's radically changing. Where now, being a Christian, particularly of our kind, of a conservative, traditional, right, Orthodox Christian, now brings the opposite. It's not respectable. It makes you unrespectable. Okay. Does Jesus have anything to say about what it looks like to follow him when people think you're dumb or stupid or terrible because you follow him? Yeah. Like, a lot. Like in the Gospels, he's constantly telling his disciples, be ready. If you think they treat me badly, guess what? They're going to treat you badly as well, right? So actually what's happening is really we're kind of in some ways just going back to normal, what it's like to be what normalcy is like for a Christian, where it is hard and you face people think negatively of you. Okay. Jesus said that's exactly what it would be like to follow him. So now we have to ask the question, okay, if Jesus knows that's the reality, so I actually shouldn't be surprised by it happening, then the only question left to ask is it worth it? Is it worth it to follow Jesus? And remember what Jesus says to the disciples. When they persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my name's sake, he doesn't say throw a pity party, right? Whine about it, complain. He says, rejoice, rejoice. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you, right? When the prophets came and told people things they didn't want to hear, people didn't go, yay, thanks for telling us how terrible we are, right? They didn't. Most of the prophets got killed. They were not welcome. But look at after the fact, they've been vindicated, haven't they? Just like Jesus was. Jesus said hard things that people did not want to hear. That's why he got killed, right? But he's been vindicated, and we will too. Another way to say this, very simple way, is we have to constantly ask ourselves this question: whose opinion of us matters? God's or the world's? Let's not pretend. We do care what people think about us, and we should. If you go through life and don't care what anybody thinks about you, that's probably a problem, right? So it's not a question of not caring at all what the world thinks. It's a question of caring much more about what God thinks than what the world thinks. Right? It's a great question. Questions down here?
Do you have any specific resources besides for the reading list on here to be speaking to somebody who tells you that they have these feelings or tendencies they're attracted to the opposite sex, and I'm looking for some way to say, yes, you can have those feelings, but this is why you don't act on them.
Yeah.
I need something a little more clear-cut to use with.
Yeah, that's a good question. So any resources to recommend for folks who are dealing with attraction to the same sex? There's a guy whose name is Christopher Yuan. Last name is Y-U-A-N. Google him. He's got a couple books that are real helpful. My wife just read both of them, really helpful. One is his personal story of coming out of a very dark gay lifestyle. That's his term. And then he's written a follow-up book as well, I think called Holy Sexuality, which would be probably a good one. And then now he's also got like I don't know if he calls it a course or what. I think it's like a video series as well that you can go through. So I would recommend his resource as a first place to stop. Yeah, good question.
Might the legalization of same-sex marriage be considered a key event that started this whole trans movement?
Well, yeah, although here's what's interesting. I actually think we have to go back a bit further. I think there's a book I recommended on your list by, Carl Trueman. Is that one on your list? Okay. If you want a great book, Carl Trueman is a church historian. He's a very good historian, and he's particularly good at tracing the history of ideas. And so he traces, basically he's trying to answer the question, how do we get to the point where somebody can say, I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, or vice versa, and people just sort of go, yes, that makes sense. Like, how do we even get to that point? He goes back several hundred years, like past Freud into Rousseau, and says, no, we've got to go back all the way there, okay? That's a helpful book for tracing the sort of ideological development that makes it meaningful. The other place I would go, though, and this is one Carl Trueman does not point out in the book, and I think it's a bit of a miss on his part. He's partly interested more on the development of ideas, but I actually think the technological development is more important than the ideological ones. Or to put it differently, I don't think those ideas would have any currency with anybody if it weren't for the technological developments. I really do think that with the arrival of contraception, for the first time in history, it becomes believable that men and women are interchangeable. Or even, if you take it a step further, that a man could become a woman, right? So if you read, the one person on your list who's really good on this is Abigail Favale in her book. She has a fascinating chapter where she talks about one of the first men to ever try to undergo transgender surgery. It had a different name back then, I'm sure, but And she says, and then she gives a more recent example. And it's incredible. She says, this early guy did it. This is back in like the 1930s or something in France. He wanted to have them implant a uterus in his body, which they did. It did not go well, as you can imagine, okay? But it's precisely because he thought that the essence of being a woman was the ability to get pregnant. Are you with me? And then she fast forwards and looks at today, and she says that idea has totally shifted, where now a transgender person just needs to put a wig on and makeup and a dress and whatever, and it has nothing to do with getting pregnant. Why? Because we have disconnected the idea of pregnancy as an innate ability of a woman, not one that every woman can do, right? We know about infertility. But as innate to what it means to be a woman, we've lost that. And so we don't even think of being a woman as meaning the kind of person who can give birth. Does that make sense? She actually really convinced me, and I was not inclined to think this before I read her book, but she convinced me that contraception has been probably the most significant thing in changing the way we think about the sexes, and thus leads to things like same-sex marriage and transgenderism as well, both of those things, that both of those flow logically from contraception. Not necessarily, I mean, societies that have contraception and have not gone down this road, but that you can't really go down that road without contraception, is how I'd say it. Sorry, that's a bit of a long answer.
Hey, I just want to say thanks for coming out here.
Yep.
Really appreciate the opportunity to learn. But I'd like to maybe pick your brain a little bit and have you expand upon the role of women in the church.
Okay.
Specifically, like I know that there's different words. I think there's about 3 different words used for kind of authoritative roles, more or less in the New Testament. And you briefly touched on deacon before, and that you had allowed women to be deacons in your church. But, along with that, there were women that, I guess, played the role of a prophet. There are also, there's at least Deborah, who played the role of a judge. And just to kind of expand upon, I guess, what those roles look like, and also just the proper or correct understanding of, I guess, the women who would have more of a public-facing or authoritative role within the church, and what that's supposed to look like.
Yeah, what that would look like, yeah. Yeah, good question. Okay, so you want to say a little bit more about that. Okay, so a couple things. I think I hinted at earlier that I think in the New Testament, the function of elder, pastor, and overseer, it's sometimes translated differently, but those are 3 different terms in Greek. I think those are all the same, describing the same role from different vantages, okay? So they do describe something different about it, but they're all describing the same function, okay? First Peter 5 is a great place to see that the 2 are basically the same. And I think where you get the idea that that role is reserved for men, qualified men again, is a passage like 1 Timothy 2, where Paul gives these instructions and says he doesn't permit a woman to teach or have authority. And then the very next section is the qualifications for elder, okay? And then the very next thing after that is qualifications for deacon, okay? Now there's debate about the deacon and deaconess thing there that we can get into if you want. But what I find is interesting is that one of the things that is most obviously different between his description of an elder and a deacon is that an elder should be able to teach, and he never says that about a deacon. Well, that seems to me to fit perfectly with what he's just said before this, of he doesn't permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. Does that make sense? And so it seems to me that what he's essentially saying is that role that is fundamentally one of teaching and having authority is reserved for qualified men. The role of deacon, which is not fundamentally about teaching and having authority, is not reserved for men. Yeah.
So, Deborah being a
yeah.
Like, she led, people.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
So, I guess I feel like there's a bit of confusion there. There's like,
yeah.
There's obviously a woman having a role of authority.
Yeah.
And then in 1 Timothy chapter 2, it looks like it's excluding women from ever having authority.
Right. So a couple of things. One, I think you find somebody, if we think about prophetesses for a second, okay, this is going to hinge a lot on your view of the spiritual gifts today, whether they're still functioning as they were in the New Testament or not. My own view is that they're not, so that we don't actually have the role of prophet today. So nobody's a prophet today, male or female, even though, yes, there were male and female prophets in the past. Does that make sense? If you're a church that still does believe prophecy is enforced today, then I would say, yeah, you can have female prophets. That's totally fine. Because the New Testament seems to have them, and so does, we have female prophets in the book of Acts. You have female prophets in the Old Testament. Not a ton, and they don't get a ton of attention, but they are there, to be sure, okay? And I think there's some reasons that explain why you can have women doing the one and not the other, and I think it has to do with the kind of authority. So keep in mind when I say the principle is not, let me say two things. One, the principle is not no woman should ever have any authority of any kind whatsoever. We're not talking about that. Every woman has some authority, of course, right? And even in the church, a deacon has a kind of authority for sure, okay? Secondly, we're not saying, and sometimes people confuse this, okay? I think this is important to say. We're not saying no man should ever learn something from a woman, okay? We're not saying that at all, ladies, okay? We're talking about the role of elder or pastor, which is a role of leadership, protection, and provision, okay? And Paul doesn't want to, but God doesn't want to put women in a position where they're asked to do that in relation to men. Why? Because he's designed men to do it in relation to women. If you think this sounds awful, I would just ask you to think about some of the awkward positions that would put a woman in. Okay, just from my practical experience as a pastor, okay? When I've got a situation in the church where I've got a husband who's abusing his wife, okay? If God wants women to be pastors and elders, okay, then you have to envision a scenario where you could have an entire board of elders that's all women, and now you've got to have a woman who's got to go in and protect another woman from her husband. Are you with me? I don't think God wants to put women in that situation, right? Of having to protect people from men. I think he wants men to protect people from bad men. Does that make sense?
I definitely understand that position.
Yeah.
I just feel like it's still, it seems like an opposition to at least the role of Deborah that we have.
Yeah, so Deborah's an interesting case because Deborah's never actually called a judge in the book of Judges, I don't think. You can go back and check me on this. Oh, really? Is she called a judge? I thought she was not specifically called a judge. Okay, I could be wrong about that. I don't teach Old Testament, as I always tell my students. But I think when you look at the book of Judges, here would be my basic argument. I am just not going to determine a lot about church polity based on the book of Judges. The whole book of Judges is about how bad Israel was. So can God use a woman in that situation? Clearly he can, yeah. But do I think that should then become normative? I don't think so. There's not a lot in the book of Judges that seems to me that's meant to be normative. In fact, the whole point seems to be everything's going badly, and God's having to intervene in some surprising ways. So does this mean I need to condemn Deborah for what she did? No. But I can look at her as a genuine exception, and I'm not going to base my church polity based on Deborah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I can also see that as a point. It's just that if you're making an exception to the rule there,
Yeah.
I feel like there might be exceptions to the rule further down.
If we get into a situation in our churches where we're like in the time of the judges and God wants to raise up a woman to set us right, I'm going to let him do that. Does that make sense? But I hope that we don't get in that situation.
Hey, Dr. Gurry, though, would you, I guess, I know you don't teach Old Testament, would you say, though, that there's a difference between a judge and being a priest?
Oh, yeah, for
right?
sure. I mean, you
so
have no
how
priest.
I would answer that question
Yeah.
is Deborah wasn't a priest, and there's never been a woman priest.
Yeah.
And so she did have a role in civil society as a leader.
Sure.
However, God still protected the priesthood,
Yeah.
the leading of the spiritual sense, right? Within
Yeah, and what's particularly striking about that in the Old Testament is all the nations around Israel have women priests. And even in the New Testament, too. Lots of cultures have women priests, but for some reason, Israel doesn't. You got to explain that. So, yeah, it's a good question. I appreciate it. We could sure talk lots more, so. It's lunchtime, isn't it? Should we do one more? I'll stick around too. So some of you may have questions. You go, I'd rather not ask that question into a microphone. I'll stick around, okay? And you can.
All right. I'll be the last question. I'm going to dumb it down, okay? So I was born in the 60s in New York.
Okay.
Moved here in 1980. Then I had the pleasure of moving to LA in the 90s. And my first experience with a transgender was a manager I hired in the late 80s. And he started wearing a dress. to work. And it was easier back then. I was told, you need to fire this individual because he's not in uniform.
Yeah.
So that was my first experience to that world. Yeah. And I commend all of you who are dealing with it in school. Grace, I think you're wonderful. Good luck to you, girl. So
New York was ahead of the curve.
Yeah, but I didn't experience it until LA, and thank the Lord I came back to Tucson, and I wasn't experiencing this, and I feel bad for my kids that they have to deal with this. When did it start? You might have answered this already. When did it become okay? Like, what did it? Is it the phones, man? Is it the technology that drove the kids?
I don't know if this one we could blame on the iPhone. I mean, there have always been people who've wanted to cross-dress, okay? You can go back to the Pentateuch and find prohibitions for Israel of that they should not confuse the two genders in this way. So God doesn't need to give a prohibition if something's never happening. So I assume that cross-dressing, if we can use that term, has been happening for a very long time. When did it become acceptable? Well, yeah, certainly more recently, right? And that comes along partly, I think, with this idea that men and women should be interchangeable, okay? So I would put some of the blame for this, not all of it, some of the blame on this at the feet of feminism, which takes this idea that men and women can only be equal if they are treated the same, okay? Well, once you say that women should be able to do everything men can do, there are going to be some men who say, well, then I want to be like a woman. Does that make sense? And in fact, it's precisely because there's a difference that you're going to sometimes have this kind of envy across the gender divide, yeah? It may seem really weird to us, but it's going to happen. You have some women who go, I envy a man's ability to do X, Y, or Z. And some men who are going to go, I envy a woman's ability to do X, Y, or Z, right? There's one, I do not know this, okay, I'm not an expert in this, but there is one expert who has studied the male transgender phenomenon, so not female, not women, but men, and his theory is that many, maybe most, adult men at least, who want to become women, it is a kind of fetish for them. And I probably won't say more than that because it gets weird and uncomfortable, but it's a kind of fetish, okay? And I could say more about it, but I forget his name. But he's one of the leading theorists. He's not very popular, as you can imagine. That's not a very popular theory. But he's thought of a lot of, and he's not a Christian of any kind. He's not even saying it's a bad thing for it to be that. But he's saying in his own clinical experience and studying it, that's his view. And I think there's something to that. As I've sort of watched the transgender moment, there's a kind of envy that you see a lot, at least in a lot of these sort of public transgender men, where so if you don't know, there's this huge, pretty vicious debate between certain kinds of feminists and the transgender movement, okay? These two do not actually get along, okay? Because the feminists realize if a man can be a woman just by saying he's a woman, then what does it mean to be a woman? Feminism kind of crumbles because feminism is supposed to be like a defense of women and their needs and particular desires and rights, right? Well, if anybody can be a woman who just says he is, feminism kind of ceases to exist, right? In some of these public debates where these feminists have been speaking out publicly against transgenderism, and particularly against sort of men and women's prisons and things like that in sports, you'll find these men who are just incredibly, they get violent. It's really quite startling to watch. And I think the irony is you actually see just how masculine they are. They use that male aggression that they know, right? But they want to force people to say that they're women, and I don't know, there's a lot more, but I don't know exactly when it changed. It's a bit of a process, so. But yeah, sorry. Wish you could say more. One more, or are we done?
There's one more?
Is there one more? No, okay, looks like we're done. Okay, sorry.
All right. Hey, well, thank you again, Dr. Gurry, for coming out. And yeah, please, let's go and come in. So a few things. I know Aiden, I know Fish, we kind of asked some of the questions, what do we believe about, women in leadership, these types of things. Well, actually, our church, we're actually going to begin kind of a leadership class beginning tomorrow. After church is every 2 weeks. This is open to anybody. It's downstairs in the NPR. I know a number of you have already attended. Some of you are actually going to attend starting tomorrow. But in this leadership class for the next 6 weeks, every other week for the next 6 sessions, we're actually going over what U City believes about women in leadership, what U City believes about the scripture, scriptures and, Jesus and some of the core doctrines of what we, try to teach through on a Sunday, but ultimately kind of in a smaller group setting. We'll go through some of those, cultural issues and how we stand and want to believe what Scripture says. And so if you're interested in coming to that, feel free to come to that. That's, again, for anybody. It's beginning tomorrow. Today's Saturday. Right? So Sunday after church, right downstairs in the NPR room. You can go right downstairs. We'll have Joey. We'll be kind of have the room all set up and everything. But for the next, 12 weeks, it's every other week for 6 sessions. We'd love to have you for that too, in case there's any questions about those. So today we're going to open up these the North Cafe. We'll have some lunch. We want to invite you to stay after, hang out for a little bit. We have some good treats for you there. And please thank Marcy and Taylor. Both of them have worked so hard to make sure we had the coffee and all the goodies and everything. They've really taken care of us this morning. But thank you for coming out today. I just want to pray for our lunch, and I know Dr. Gurry will be up here. If you have any more questions or follow up, and if you are interested in maybe attending Phoenix Seminary, getting more information about that, I know he can answer some questions, but I can also as well. That's where I attended seminary, and it was a great school. Learned a lot and challenged a lot and grew a lot. And so I would definitely, if you're seeking to kind of take those steps towards seminary, it is a great choice for you to do that. So let me pray for our lunch, and then we'll go from there. Father, we lift up this time, God. Thank you so much for Dr. Gurry. Thank you for how he invested in our congregation, invested in our own faith, God. And I do pray, God, there was something in today's talks, God, that just really stuck with us, something we can wrestle with ourselves in our own faith. At the same time, God, something we can be able to help love and care for each other, God, better. And so I do pray, God, for, I know, again, we kind of, as pastors, we can kind of live in this closed environment where, again, we're working with other believers, other Christians, but ultimately it's the congregation, Lord, the sheep who are out there, and they're working in places that, again, you call them to die to themselves, and there's a cost to that, God, especially in some of these cultural issues and certain things that their coworkers maybe believe, or certain people and their bosses maybe ask them to subject themselves to. So I pray for an abundance of wisdom, an abundance of discernment, an abundance of faith, and again, that would just be something that they'd be able to say, no, I'm sticking with Jesus. I trust in Jesus, and I'm going to go this path. So God, I pray for even stories and other stories just like Grace's. People have to be able to navigate these waters. So I pray for an abundance of discernment, an abundance of truth, but also an abundance of grace that can love them and can kind of place that pebble in people's shoe to be able to ultimately turn their heart and eyes to you, Lord. And so I pray you would continue to equip this congregation, your people, to build up, God, to build them up, to be able to serve you in ways that bring glory to you, God. And so thank you for creating us who we are. Help us to walk in those roles, to walk in the manhood or womanhood you've given us, to be able just to bring glory to you and to love those well around us, Lord. So please, can just bless everyone here. Thank you for the giving up of their time today to spend learning together. And I pray for this food. Bless it to our bodies. Bless the conversation, God, and continue to prepare us, God, to be your servants, your voice, your hands and feet in this world around us, that we may show your glory and people may encounter you through us. In the mighty name of Jesus, amen. All right, so please help yourself in the North Cafe and, fill up on lunch.